Let us next examine the Primarch Sanguinius. He spent his early life on the irradiated deadly moon Bal Secundus, being taught by the humans trying to eke out existence there. In this, he has some similarity of background to Mortarion, who grew up on the toxic, deadly world of Barbarus. Sanguinius was renowned by the people of Bal Secundus for killing mighty wild animals. In this, he has some similarity of background to Vulcan. He gathered the humans of Bal Secundus into an army and led them against the mutants of that moon in order to bring about the society he wanted. In this, he has some similarity of background to Lorgar, who led an army to bring about his chosen theocracy. We shall compare and contrast. The early life of Sanguinius on Bal Secundus presents an interesting mix of hardship, leadership, and destiny, which parallels the experiences of Mortarion, Vulcan, or Lorgar. Each of these Primarchs faced adversity, wrestled with the nature of power, and emerged as leaders in their respective ways. However, their responses to adversity, their leadership styles, and their guiding principles diverged in key ways. Sanguinius and Mortarion. Overcoming toxic environments was their big thing. They had some parallels. Sanguinius lived on Bal Secundus, an irradiated, toxic moon filled with dangerous mutants and radiation-soaked wastelands. Mortarion grew up on Barbarus, a world choked by chemical mists so toxic that even the humans who lived there could not survive without shelter deep in the valleys. Both were exposed to deadly environments from a young age. They each survived, fighting against superhuman foes. Sanguinius faced off against massive deadly beasts and mutant warlords on Bal Secundus. His ability to slay these creatures became part of his legend. Mortarion waged a relentless battle against the tyrannical Xenos warlords who ruled Barbarus, including his adoptive father. These Xenos were not only physically formidable, but also possessed powerful sorcery. They raised an army from the oppressed to fight alongside them. Sanguinius united the surviving humans of Bal Secundus into a cohesive force, teaching them to work together to overthrow the mutant hordes. Mortarion gathered human survivors of Barbarus, equipped them with primitive respirators, and led them in open rebellion against the alien overlords. But then there are also contrasts between the two of them, notably in their approach to leadership. Sanguinius inspired his people with hope, compassion, and divine presence. He sought to uplift them and create a society founded on brotherhood. Mortarion inspired his followers with shared suffering and endurance. His leadership was based on hardship and the belief that only through pain could one be strong. They also had a different relationship with death. Sanguinius, despite facing great danger in battle against monsters, embraced hope, beauty, and nobility. His philosophy was life-affirming, even before his first prophetic vision of his eventual death against Horus. Mortarion developed a fatalistic worldview, shaped by Barbarus's toxic atmosphere and the omnipresent death that surrounded him. This led to his later obsession with disease, decay, and inevitability. They had a different sense of purpose. Sanguinius was driven by a sense of destiny and higher purpose, believing in the sanctity of life and of the Emperor's divine vision, after he met the Emperor. Mortarion was driven by resentment and rebellion, first against the Xenos overlords of Barbarus, and later against the Emperor himself, whom he perceived as yet another overlord. From these comparisons, we can see that, while both Sanguinius and Mortarion overcame poisonous environments and fought powerful enemies, Sanguinius responded by embracing hope and compassion, while Mortarion embraced bitterness and endurance. Sanguinius saw himself as a savior, while Mortarion viewed himself as a survivor. And so we can see the difference between nature and nurture, between their worlds and their selves. Sanguinius chose hope. Now let us look at Sanguinius and Vulcan, mighty mythic heroes and slayers of monsters. They, of course, have parallels together. First, their mythic feats of monster slaying. Sanguinius became a legend on Baal Secundus for his ability to slay horrible mutant warlords and deadly beasts with his bare hands, gigantic irradiated mutant scorpions and shit. Vulcan famously hunted and slew massive, dangerous monsters on Nocturne, including the mighty salamanders. His exploits became mythologized as tests of strength, endurance, and resolve. They both served as icons of hope and protection to the humans of their worlds. Sanguinius represented hope, beauty, and the possibility of salvation in a horrible world. His people believed he was a divine figure sent to save them from the mutants of Baal, which was almost true. Vulcan was seen as a protector, a father figure, and a guardian of his people. He taught them smithing, crafting, and self-defense, embodying the father-god figure seen in many indigenous religions. They were masters of the physical and martial arts. They were both physically exceptional as Primarchs, of course. Sanguinius was graceful, swift, and angelic, depicted in later imperial culture as an elegant duelist, either the best or second best in the Imperium. Vulcan was immensely strong, enduring, and implacable, embodying raw power, fortitude, and resilience. But then we should contrast the two. Despite appearing initially similar, they do have differing views on things. Sanguinius fought to protect life and only took up violence when necessary. Even his later death at Horus's hands was framed as an act of sacrificial love. Vulcan embraced violence as a necessary tool of survival, but he did not shy away from it in the same philosophical sense. His role as a smith and craftsman reinforced the idea that violence could be forged into a weapon or object of protection. Their relationship with mortality was different, perhaps the most striking difference between the two. Sanguinius knew he would die once he started having prophetic visions of his death at the hands of Horus, but he faced his death with courage and resolve. Vulcan, as a perpetual, was effectively immortal. Maybe still is effectively immortal in modern 40K. We don't know. He returned from death again and again. This gave him a different perspective on sacrifice and mortality, as he didn't have to confront the finality of death in the same way as Sanguinius. Sanguinius became the image of the sacrificial martyr in the Imperium. His death at Horus's hands elevated him to near divine status in the Imperium's mythology, described in the Arbites novels as being depicted in a triptych alongside Saint Sebastian Thor and someone else whose name escapes me at the moment. Vulcan, through his survival and ability to endure, became an enduring symbol of persistence, patience, and rebirth. Both Sanguinius and Vulcan were seen as heroes and protectors of humanity. But where Sanguinius fought for beauty, mercy, and love, Vulcan fought for resilience, patience, and strength. Sanguinius's grace and martyrdom contrast with Vulcan's endurance and immortality. Dolan? Was it Saint Dolan? Whatever, read the book yourselves. Anyway, Sanguinius and Lorgar, believers and prophets, they shaped their societies with ideas and belief. Sanguinius shaped Baal's human population into an unified, orderly society, founded on ideals of honor, nobility, and purity. Lorgar forged a religious empire on Colchis, uniting warring factions under the banner of a shared faith and waging two massive religious wars to purify it by ridding the planet of the influence of what he did not know was chaos. They both had intensely charismatic leadership. Sanguinius's angelic appearance and graceful, noble presence inspired awe and reverence among those who saw him. His charisma was rooted in hope and compassion. Lorgar was the prophet king, whose followers believed he was the living voice of divine truth. His charisma was rooted in spiritual fervor and oratory. They each had connection to destiny and fate through prophetic visions. Sanguinius saw visions of his death at Horus's hands. Lorgar, meanwhile, received divine revelation through religion's vision of the arrival of the Emperor and Magnus. Both of them embraced these visions, though Sanguinius faced his fate with dignity. Lorgar sought to reshape the world to fit the fate he thought he saw, eventually causing him to turn to chaos. That is to say, we'll get to this more in detail later, Lorgar saw the arrival of a god. When the emperor said that wasn't him, he went and found a god. They also had contrasts. Sanguinius believed in the emperor as a symbol of divine purpose and viewed himself as a servant of a higher cause. Lorgar revered the emperor as a god, and when the emperor rejected that notion, he sought to worship chaos instead. This can also be seen in the form of their relationship with authority. Sanguinius accepted his role within the emperor's grand plan, though he knew it would mean eventually sacrificing himself. Lorgar rejected many of the things that the emperor said outright, and sought to create a theocracy within the Imperium, centered on his personal vision of the emperor's divinity. This ultimately led to rejection. Sanguinius maintained faith in his role even when faced with his own death, but Lorgar responded to the emperor's rejection with bitterness, seeking validation from an outside source, chaos, instead. Both Sanguinius and Lorgar were prophets of destiny, but their responses to their fates were drastically different. Sanguinius embraced his fate, knowing that his death would be meaningful, while Lorgar rebelled against fate by trying to shape it into being what he thought it was, imposing his will on the universe and the warp. Sanguinius thus shares parallels with Mortarion, Vulcan, and Lorgar, but the key to his uniqueness lies in his choices, his acceptance of his fate, his decision to emphasize hope, and his sacrificial love. Each of these other Primarchs faced adversity and emerged as leaders, but their personalities were shaped by how they confronted suffering, destiny, and authority in ultimately different ways than Sanguinius. Mortarion was hardened by his suffering and the Emperor's showing him up, I guess we could call it, leading to his becoming fatalistic and bitter. Vulcan learned patience, becoming a symbol of endurance, and Lorgar sought purpose in faith, becoming a zealot. Sanguinius accepted fate, embodying hope and nobility. Sanguinius stands apart because he embraced his suffering, he embraced his doom without succumbing to despair. His sacrifice became a symbol of all that the Imperium strives to be, a noble struggle to preserve hope in the face of seemingly inevitable darkness. Next, we shall examine the first meeting of the Emperor and Sanguinius. This was one of the occasions in which a Primarch immediately accepted their father. Sanguinius seemingly had visions of the future about the Emperor, similar in some ways to Conrad Kurs and Lorgar. Kurs and Lorgar both turned traitor, but Sanguinius was loyal, so the impact of prophecy may be complicated. This was also one of the occasions in which a Primarch was approached by the Emperor only after achieving ultimate success of planetary unification and defeat of their primary enemy. similar to a few other Primarchs. Was the first meeting's occurrence after a Primarch achieving success correlated with their remaining loyal later? The first meeting between the Emperor and Sanguinius is often held up, especially in-universe, as one of the most ideal and harmonious of all the Primarch reunifications. Sanguinius immediately accepted the Emperor, recognizing him as a divine figure that he had foreseen in his prophetic visions. This contrasts with Conrad Kurs and Lorgar, who also had prophetic visions. But Lorgar responded by imposing his own thoughts of what they meant, and Kurs responded to his fate with dread, paranoia, and rebellion. The context of Sanguinius' success in uniting Bal Secundus before the Emperor's arrival also mirrors the reunification process of other Primarchs. In several cases, the Emperor either waited for the Primarchs to achieve ultimate victory over their homeworlds before publicly revealing himself, or he just happened by fate and chance to not arrive until after they had achieved victory. Looking at it more deeply, the correlation between achieving planetary dominance and later loyalty is not straightforward. Let's take a look at the symbolic and practical elements of Sanguinius' first meeting with the Emperor, the role of prophecy, and how it compares to other Primarchs. We already talked about Lorgar. Let's talk about Kurs. Sanguinius versus Conrad Kurs. They both had visions of destiny. Sanguinius foresaw the arrival of the Emperor and accepted him as a prophesied figure of destiny. He also foresaw his own death at Horus's hands. But instead of resisting fate, he accepted it as necessary for the greater good. Conrad Kurs had prophetic visions of the future, including meeting the Emperor, the destruction of his homeworld, the fall of the Imperium, his own death at the hands of an assassin sent by the Emperor, and the eventual corruption of his legion. Unlike Sanguinius, Kurs was overwhelmed by these visions and decided that they must be true, using them as justification for his descent into violence and cruelty. Sanguinius' visions inspired loyalty because he saw himself as part of a greater divine plan. Knowing his fate did not drive him to despair, but freed him to act. It strengthened his resolve. Knowing that he would die at the hands of Horus necessarily meant he would not die at the hands of anyone else. So throughout the Great Crusade, he threw himself into the thickest part of battle to fight the alien without fear. Conrad Kurs' visions, meanwhile, led to fatalism and paranoia. He saw fate as a trap that he could not escape. But things being prophesied justified his self-destructive behavior and contempt for authority. If something was inevitable, then he couldn't have moral blame for doing it. Sanguinius accepted his fate willingly, choosing to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Kurs embraced fatalism and cynicism, believing that because fate could not be changed, he was free to act, and perhaps even bound to act, according to his most violent instincts. And so both Sanguinius and Kurs possessed foresight. But while Sanguinius' visions inspired acceptance and courage, Kurs' visions led to nihilism and rebellion. The perception of fate determines the response to fate. Sanguinius embraced it with faith, while Kurs saw it as a curse. Okay, more complicated subject now. The role of a Primarch's achievement before the Emperor's arrival. In many cases, there's this idea that the Emperor allowed his Primarchs to achieve ultimate victory before revealing himself. This is an important theme. This method of reunion sent a clear message that the Primarch was a capable leader in their own right. Did this pattern correlate with later loyalty? Okay, so those who achieved independence or dominance before meeting the Emperor. There were some who achieved planetary unification, like Sanguinius, Guilliman, and Jagatai Khan, who later remained loyal. This pattern correlates to a sense of personal agency, perhaps. They were given a chance to act as sovereign rulers and knew that their worth was recognized by the emperor. Yes, Ferrus Manus and Leman Russ later tested the emperor when he arrived, but the pattern holds. Then there were those who were rescued mid-crisis. The Primarchs Mortarion and Angron were midway through a war and had victory snatched away by the emperor, leading to resentment. They never had a chance to win on their own terms, and this humiliation planted the seeds of betrayal. Whereas we can see that Corax was mid-victory, and the emperor allowed him to win on his own terms. Kurs, notably, never won on Nostramo, as his reign of terror was a continuous cycle of violence, which was unsustainable without him. He did not have a clear moment of triumph to establish his legacy. Victory alone did not ensure loyalty. Lorgar, Magnus, and Fulgrim, and Perturabo, all achieved victory before meeting the emperor. Horus and Alfarius may have, but that's really complicated and we don't know for sure, but they all still turn traitor. The critical distinction here is temperament and philosophy. Sanguinius accepted fate, and he chose to see himself as part of a divine plan. Lorgar sought to impose his will on faith, and Horus succumbed to ambition and jealousy. It's about choice, people. Choice. Nothing was inevitable. When the emperor waited for a Primarch to achieve victory before revealing itself, it often strengthened the Primarch's sense of personal agency and worth. And several of them, notably Sanguinius, Guilliman, Jagatai Khan, Ferrus Manus, Leman Russ, they felt validated by this process. And yes, those who didn't get that moment, Mortarion, Angron, Kurs, they felt humiliated or disempowered. However, factors like temperament and philosophy ultimately carried more weight than just victory and circumstance. We can learn more from the first meeting of Sanguinius and the emperor. There's the power of recognition and acceptance. The emperor did not need to force Sanguinius into loyalty. By appearing as the prophesied figure in Sanguinius's visions, he played into the role of divine destiny. This contrasts with Mortarion's experience, where the emperor's intervention was seen as theft of opportunity, and with Lorgar, who felt abandoned when his vision of the emperor as a god was rejected. Sanguinius's acceptance of his prophetic visions as part of a greater divine plan placed him in the role of the sacrificial martyr. In contrast, Conrad Kurs was tormented by his visions and sought to defy and embrace fate as a tool. This reflects the classical mythological difference between heroic sacrifice, as Sanguinius, and fatalistic doom, as with Kurs. Those Primarchs who were allowed to achieve victory before meeting the emperor had a higher chance of internalizing loyalty as a choice, but it was still only a chance. Those who were rescued mid-crisis, Mortarion, Angron, and Kurs, perceived the emperor as an intruder, fostering resentment, but that too was a choice. Forgiveness was an option. The first meeting between Sanguinius and the emperor exemplifies the ideal father-son relationship of Warhammer 40,000, despite the emperor refusing to see himself as a father. Sanguinius did not see himself as a pawn or a victim of fate, but as a willing participant in the emperor's higher plan. His love for the emperor was not conditional, so this puts him in a different boat than that of Lorgar or Angron. His ability to see fate clearly and accept it made him a martyr and the ultimate symbol of the Imperium's noblest ideals. His first meeting with the emperor exemplifies the notion that true loyalty is born of not just compulsion, but of mutual recognition. All right, let's look at the beginnings of his interstellar leadership. Prior to meeting Sanguinius, His legion was known as the Revenant, and they had a black, cursed reputation for uncontainable violence, similar to the bloody reputation of the later World Eaters. Sanguinius spent much of his early leadership having his legion intentionally fight alongside other legions he viewed as honorable, as a form of apprenticeship, in order to help remake them in the image of his hopes for them. How does this compare with other legions who were attached as auxiliary forces or allies much of the time, such as the Emperor's Children, Raven Guard, and Iron Warriors? The story of Sanguinius transforming the Revenant into the Blood Angels offers rich thematic parallels with the histories of the Emperor's Children, Raven Guard, and Iron Warriors, particularly in how the integration of a Primarch reshaped the character of the Legion, while Sanguinius pursued a path of redemption and self-improvement for his warriors. Other Primarchs had differing approaches to their own legion's flaws. Let's take a look at the similarities and differences in them. So the initial reputation of the Legion. Before being united with their Primarchs, many legions had distinct reputations shaped by their early campaigns, such as those in the Unification Wars on Terra, but those reputations were sometimes quite negative. We can look notably at the reputation of the Space Wolves before meeting Leman Russ, and the Blood Angels, then known as the Revenant, before meeting Sanguinius. They were infamous for uncontrollable bloodlust and violence. They were often viewed as bloodthirsty berserkers. We shall examine other legions at a later time, but the examples stand. We should perhaps look at the flawed legion trope and the parallel between the Blood Angels and the World Eaters. The Blood Angels had an early reputation for uncontrolled violence, with the Revenant being prone to berserk rages, much like how the World Eaters would later behave. There is some conflicting evidence to suggest that the Warhounds, before they were renamed the World Eaters, also had similar reputations. I don't know, man. Canon is hard. However, Sanguinius chose to reform his legion through mentorship and inspiration, whereas Angron did the opposite, imposing the trauma of the Butcher's Nails onto his legion. Both the Iron Warriors and the Blood Angels carried reputations for being relentless in battle, but the Iron Warriors under Perturabo were known for their cold, methodical siegecraft, while the Blood Angels had more of a raw, refined savagery, to contrast with their early Revenant reputation. They excelled at shock assaults and assault squads and jump packs and all that. Perturabo fed into his legion's negative traits by ultimately reinforcing their role as siege breakers by not speaking up, which isolated them emotionally. In contrast, Sanguinius lifted his warriors up, pushing them to embrace nobility and artistic expression, as seen in their love of visual art and sculpture, without allowing it to overawe their general mission of serving the Imperium, as happened with some of the Emperor's Children. Sanguinius's methods differed greatly from other Primarchs. He intentionally sought to embed his warriors in campaigns with legions like the Ultramarines and Imperial Fists, who he viewed as fighting honorably, to expose them to models of nobility, discipline, and honor. This was a conscious effort to reshape the legion's culture by immersing them with positive role models, sometimes under the command of those other legions. No other Primarch used this method, though the Emperor's Children did adopt the ideals of perfection from the Emperor's early praise, and they did fight alongside other legions as an auxiliary force in their early days when their numbers were quite small. But this wasn't an intentional choice. By comparison, The Raven Guard focused on internal reflection and sometimes avoided collaboration with other legions, going off to fight their own way, like the White Scars. And then the Iron Warriors, their role became solitary siege breakers, fostering their isolation rather than their integration. And this was partially a choice, and it was partially their decision to not speak up when it was forced upon them. Sanguinius himself was an exemplar of nobility and grace, contrasting sharply with Perturabo and Angron, who ruled their legions with iron will and brutality, or Kurz, who was just a figure of remote fear. Lorgar sought to transform his legion's worldview, but his method was ideological, using religious indoctrination rather than being an example and a role model. Sanguinius, in his role as a living icon of virtue, gave his warriors something higher to aspire to: beauty, art, nobility. This symbolic and aspirational leadership stands in contrast to the authoritarian leadership of Perturabo, the ideological leadership of Lorgar, or the fear-based tyranny of Kurz. The Blood Angels learned a lot from their allied campaigns in those early days. They reformed through integration and mimicry. The use of more noble, honorable legions as models provided the Revenant with a vision of what they could become, and a lesson that they did not have to be what they had been. The transformation into the Blood Angels was not just functional, teaching them discipline and combined arms tactics, but also cultural, with beauty, nobility, art, and diplomacy being important to them. This method could have been applied to Angron's World Eaters, but no comparable mentorship was offered to them by Angron, or forced upon them by the Emperor. Meanwhile, the Iron Warriors reformed through isolation. They were often assigned to thankless siege duties, becoming the unsung grunts of the Great Crusade, and they prided themselves on not complaining, which is a terrible plan. This isolation only deepened their bitterness and desire for recognition. Rather than using alliances for reform, Perturabo internalized resentment, much as his legion did. The Emperor could have exposed the Iron Warriors to different battlefronts, perhaps assigning them to wars involving more maneuver and swift action, but this opportunity was never granted, and Perturabo, sure as shit, was not going to seek it out. He was not going to ask for it. The Emperor's children, their quest for perfection was initially a positive pursuit. However, when Fulgrim embraced his superiority complex, his warriors pursued perfection at all costs, falling to hedonism and pride. If Fulgrim had sought external guidance from another legion, instead of only doing such mentorship when it was needed by his low numbers, then perhaps the Emperor's children might have retained their humility. Instead, Fulgrim leaned inward, reinforcing his idea that they were already the best and leading to toxic perfectionism. Corvus Corax, meanwhile, intentionally distanced his legion from other forces, believing that his stealth tactics required secrecy and independence. The Raven Guard's isolation mirrored the emotional isolation of Conrad Kurz, although Corax retained his moral compass. By relying entirely on their own culture, the Raven Guard became masters of stealth, but also victims of isolation, much like the Night Lords. They were independent because they didn't trust other people, not because they valued independence in its own right, like the White Scars. By seeking out the mentorship of other legions, Sanguinius reoriented his warriors toward nobility, honor, and beauty. Rather than doubling down on their flaws, he sought to uplift them and redeem them. This is a sharp contrast to Perturabo's bitterness, Fulgrim's pride, and Angron's trauma, whose leadership styles reinforced their legion's pre-existing flaws and introduced new ones. No other Primarch used cultural immersion as a leadership tool, like Sanguinius did. He was the only one to seek out mentorship. He understood that his warriors' bloodlust wasn't their fault and didn't treat it as a moral failing. Instead, he exposed them to healthier models of behavior so that they could choose to be better. If this method had been applied to Angron's world eaters, perhaps by the Emperor assigning them to campaigns with the Salamanders or later the Blood Angels, the World Eaters might have reoriented themselves towards loyalty. Legions that operated in isolation, the Raven Guard, the White Scars, the Iron Warriors, often became insular and mistrustful, and sometimes, like the Iron Warriors, they became resentful. Whereas legions that fought alongside others, the Blood Angels and Ultramarines, often developed a healthier, more balanced worldview. This is not a guarantee, this is a propensity. The Death Guard fought alongside the Sons of Horus and other legions in the central, most important battlegrounds of the Great Crusade very often, but they fell. Whatever. Anyway, Sanguinius' strategy to redeem through mentorship was the most successful leadership model in the Horus Heresy saga. By exposing his warriors to nobility instead of simply demanding it, he achieved a complete transformation of their culture. The Revenant became the Blood Angels, not through violence or indoctrination, but through inspiration. As we discussed previously, the Warhounds, later renamed by Angron as the World Eaters, developed factions of different responses to their Primarch, ultimately leading to internecine violence. Let's look at the reaction of the Revenant Legion to Sanguinius, especially with an eye on Terran origin Marines compared to Baal origin Marines. I feel that these differing reactions reveal important themes of identity, loyalty, and transformation. There are key differences between the Warhounds and the Revenant, rooted in Sanguinius' leadership philosophy and temperament. While Angron's arrival prompted fractious violence and an escalation of brutality, Sanguinius inspired reverence and a collective shift in purpose. But the transformation was not without its tensions. The Revenant Legion had gained a reputation for being relentless, grim, and ghost-like on the battlefield. Similar to the early Warhounds, they were used as brutal shock troops. They earned a reputation for excessive violence, and in some cases a disregard for civilian life. Their behavior was seen as closer to that of the early World Eaters, although it lacked their ritualized savagery, and it lacked the performative terror of the later Night Lords. Without a guiding Primarch, before they met Sanguinius, that is, the Revenant's identity was fragmented. The Terran recruits, veterans of the Unification Wars, carried with them the militarism and pragmatism of that era. Their sense of duty was pragmatic but unrefined, and it contrasted with their red thirst, which they didn't know how to understand or control. Without a clear guiding ethos, they defaulted to the role of brutal compliance enforcers. But then Sanguinius arrived. When Sanguinius was united with his legion, the shift was profound, though not immediate. This was a moment of convergence between two worlds and two identities. The Terran origin Revenants, hardened by the Unification Wars, were grim, expedient, accustomed to brutal, bloody war without idealism. Their loyalty was to the Great Crusade, the Emperor, and their role as soldiers. But then they met Sanguinius, and they had a flood of Baal origin recruits, shaped by Sanguinius's vision and inspired by his nobility, grace, and ideals of martial honor. The Baal origin Marines' worldview was more romantic, seeing war as a path to nobility and heroism, rather than mere slaughter. The Terran Origins' initial response to Sanguinius, they respected strength and leadership, and when they first witnessed Sanguinius's divine presence, many saw him as a figure of mythological stature. His angelic appearance with the golden hair and the wings and the otherworldly beauty inspired awe and confusion. Some Terran Marines, grounded in the blood-filled battlefields of the Unification Wars, viewed his arrival with a degree of skepticism, as they were not immediately swayed by mysticism or beauty. However, Sanguinius's battlefield prowess left no room for doubt. When they saw him slay enormous beasts and terrible enemies with his own hands, they recognized him as a fellow warrior, not just a figure of myth. The people of Baal Secundus, when they were recruited into the Blood Angels Legion, already knew of Sanguinius as a living legend. On Baal, he had risen as a liberator and leader, uniting many of the people of Baal Secundus against the mutant tribes. His followers saw him as a savior and a messianic figure, and many of them had fought directly under his command already. When they were inducted into the Revenant Legion and met the Terran veterans, they brought with them a sense of idealism and devotion. To them, Sanguinius was not just a Primarch. He was divine. He was destined for greatness. The most dramatic change following Sanguinius's arrival was the transformation of the Legion's philosophies, aesthetics, and creed of war, even more than their actual methods of war, their tactics and strategies. So he changed their name from the Revenant to the Blood Angels to mark a symbolic break with the past and represent their rebirth as warriors of nobility and honor. This contrasts with the Warhounds becoming the World Eaters, which marked a descent into violence and ultimately madness. They adopted aesthetic ideals. Sanguinius emphasized beauty and artistry, encouraging his sons to see themselves as warriors of light. Their armor became more ornate, featuring symbols of angels, blood drops, and images of Sanguinius. They had a different moral philosophy. He transformed the Legion's relationship with war. Violence was not the end goal. It became a means of achieving something greater. Redemption, salvation, unification, liberation. This shift was deeply spiritual, drawing stark contrasts with the nihilism of the Night Lords and the violence of the World Eaters. Unlike the Warhounds, whose divisions became irreconcilable and led to violence, the Blood Angels successfully unified their Terran and Baalite origin Marines, though not without difficulty. They had a cultural divide. The Terrans had to be convinced that art, beauty, and honor had any place in war. They had seen the brutality of the Unification Wars, where survival was all that mattered. Some Terran veterans viewed Baalite idealism as naive. The Terran Origin Marines initially expected to retain their hard-nosed methods, but Sanguinius made a shift in leadership style. He promoted Baalites into some leadership roles, believing that they better understood his vision for the Blood Angels in a manner more important than just seniority. Some Terrans saw this as favoritism and resented being sidelined, mirroring the divisions seen in the World Eaters between those loyal to Angron's vision, Karn, and those loyal to the Imperium and the old warhound's identity, lacking the butcher's nails. The Ballite recruits' quasi-religious devotion to Sanguinius was also unsettling to Terrans, who had fought against religious zealots in the Unification Wars. So why did the Blood Angels succeed where the World Eaters failed? Well, generally it's because Sanguinius understood people and cared about them. He led with compassion. He did not impose his vision by force. Rather, he inspired his sons with humility and patience. He integrated. He didn't just replace. Unlike Angron, who sought to remake his legion in his own flawed and injured image, Sanguinius sought to unite both cultures into a new synthesis. He respected the Terrans' perspective. He didn't belittle the Terrans' successes in war or what they cared about. He just offered them a new goal, nobility, and artistry, and gave them examples in their mentorship to live up to, rather than destroying their old perspective. And then, of course, there's the embodiment of ideals. Angron personified rage, but Sanguinius personified beauty and sacrifice and martial valor. His own personal conduct set an example that both Terran and Ballite origin Marines admired. The fate of the Blood Angels versus the World Eaters demonstrates the role of a Primarch's leadership in shaping a legion's identity. Where Angron failed to heal the fractures of his legion, Sanguinius succeeded by focusing on shared purpose and unity. The Blood Angels are a legion that, despite their flaws, the red thirst, later the black rage, they stand as a testament to what great leadership can achieve. If Sanguinius had led the World Eaters instead of Angron, might they have remained loyal? This is one of my great what-ifs of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. What if you swapped legions and Primarchs? Perhaps the path of the World Eaters was never fate, but a failure of leadership. But we'll get to that later. Sanguinius's emotional needs during his period of early interstellar leadership were deeply tied to his role as both a unifying figure and a burdened soul, notably connection and brotherhood. Sanguinius's inherent charisma and empathy made him crave genuine connection with his legion and his brothers. He needed bonds that went beyond duty, where his unique challenges could be understood and shared. He needed reassurance in the face of his curse. The red thirst, the knowledge of his sons, the Blood Angels' genetic flaws, weighed heavily on Sanguinius, and he worried about them being sanctioned by the Emperor. He needed reassurance that his value as a leader and son of the Emperor outweighed the potential dangers of his curse to himself and to his legion. He needed recognition of his sacrifice and effort. He often bore the burden of hope for his legion and others. He needed acknowledgement of the emotional and physical toll of being the angelic figure that others placed their faith in, as well as the sacrifices he made to live up to those expectations. The freedom to be himself was important. As a paragon of beauty and nobility, Sanguinius was idealized by some in universe and out to the point of being dehumanized. He needed spaces where he could express vulnerability or doubt without fear of diminishing the image others held of him. And then he had a vision of peace beyond war that he needed. Sanguinius had a fundamentally hopeful vision for humanity. He needed to believe in a future where the galaxy could move beyond constant war, and where his efforts would contribute to lasting harmony, even after his own death. His leadership style was rooted in empathy and understanding, and he thrived when he could lead with the value of compassion. He needed that. He needed missions and responsibilities that aligned with his desire to uplift and inspire rather than simply destroy. like the Iron Warriors had. The consequences of neglecting these needs. If these needs were unmet, Sanguinius risked becoming isolated by his perfection, overburdened by his role, and deeply vulnerable to despair of his legion's flaws. However, his ability to maintain hope and inspire others, even in the darkest times, made him one of the most emotionally resilient Primarchs. What deeds of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels, prior to the events of the Horus Heresy, can provide us with insight into their character and their growing relationships with other Primarchs and legions and imperial institutions. The pre-Horus Heresy era of the Great Crusade provides many key moments that reveal the character of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels Legion, as well as their relationships with other Primarchs, legions, and imperial institutions. These moments highlight themes of nobility, sacrifice, brotherhood, and tragic foresight that would become pivotal in the events of the heresy. Before the Horus Heresy, the Blood Angels had a distinguished record in the Great Crusade, serving as one of the Emperor's most effective and versatile legions. Unlike the World Eaters, or Night Lords, who relied on brutality and fear, the Blood Angels balanced force with diplomacy. The character traits of the Blood Angels can be described thusly. They were the knights of the Imperium. The Blood Angels were viewed as paragons of honor, blending their martial prowess of the Imperial Fists, or the World Eaters, with the artistic sensibilities of the Emperor's children. They were embodiments of beauty and destruction. They were renowned for their martial prowess and physical perfection, but they were also haunted by the curse of the Red Thirst, their uncontrollable bloodlust. And then they were guardians of humanity. Sanguinius's compassion and humility were reflected in his legion. The Blood Angels were known to act as protectors of civilian population, not quite to the extent of the Salamanders, a notable distinction from the likes of the World Eaters, Night Lords, or even the Imperial Fists, who often saw humans as expendable collateral damage. They had some key campaigns which were well enough described in canon that we can describe them here and do something useful with them. Thank goodness. These key campaigns provide insight into their values, growth, and relationships with other legions and institutions. The conquest of Melchior. The Blood Angels fought alongside the Luna Wolves to bring the world of Melchior into compliance. Sanguinius talked Horus out of using the Blood Angels for a simple frontal assault, instead opting for an orbital deep strike. Sanguinius's Blood Angels served as the hammer, and Horus's Luna Wolves the anvil, in the great final battle against the Nephilim, a reversal of how the Luna Wolves usually fought alongside the Death Guard, using the Death Guard as their own anvil. Sanguinius's positioning of his legion as a preeminent assault force paid off with great success against the Xenos, showing Sanguinius's strength and focus. Sanguinius's participation in the extermination of the Nephilim showed his unwillingness to show mercy towards those who would harm humanity. The big one, the war on murder. The Blood Angels, Luna Wolves, and Iron Hands fought against the Megarachnids on the planet they called Murder. This campaign revealed Sanguinius's willingness to adapt to difficult environments. His adaptability contrasts with Primarchs like Perturabo, who relied on methodical siege tactics, or Mortarion, who preferred overwhelming attritional warfare. His patience and foresight were evident, as he delayed committing his legion until he understood the nature of the enemy. This cooperation between Sanguinius and Horus in the campaign hinted at their strong bond. It foreshadows Horus's later betrayal making the emotional impact on Sanguinius all the more profound. We'll probably talk more about this campaign when we talk about Horus. Anyway, the relationships between Sanguinius and other Primarchs were pivotal in shaping later events in the Horus heresy, as were Sanguinius's relationships with other imperial institutions. If we count the emperor as an institution, Sanguinius was the emperor's most beloved son, maybe even more than Horus. Hard to tell. The emperors trusted Sanguinius to be a stabilizing force and an example, as evidenced by his later role at the Siege of Terra. The Adeptus Custodes held Sanguinius in the highest regard, even seeing him as one of the few Primarchs who embodied the emperor's vision for humanity. They respected Sanguinius the way that most humans respected all of the Primarchs. The Blood Angels were respected by the imperial army as protectors and good allies. Sanguinius's emphasis on protecting civilians and combined arms doctrine earned him admiration from ordinary soldiers. We can contrast this with the relationship between the imperial army and Perturabo, which is more or less the relationship between a pig and a butcher. The Blood Angels' pre-heresy campaigns show Sanguinius as a paragon of honor, self-control, and nobility, striving to lift the Blood Angels above their genetic flaw. Unlike the World Eaters who succumbed to their flaws, Sanguinius taught his sons to master their inner darkness. His compassion, foresight, and tragic fate at foresight. Anyway, made him a beloved figure not only among his legion, but across the Imperium. The Blood Angels became symbols of hope, standing in stark contrast to the more fatalistic or nihilistic legions like the Night Lords and World Eaters. One of the things we should examine for each legion in turn is how the Primarch was viewed and treated by both the Emperor and the Custodes, and how things may have been different if there had been a member of the Custodes acting as liaison for each Primarch. We've already discussed this for Angron, and we'll discuss the other legions later. For now, let us look at the Blood Angels specifically, expand on how the Emperor and Custodes viewed Sanguinius, and compare and contrast the potential role of a custodian as an alternate source of authority and moral clarity in the World Eaters, with the potential role of a custodian in the Blood Angels. The relationship between the Emperor, the Adeptus Custodes, and Sanguinius was one of the only really emotionally significant of all the Primarchs. Unlike other Primarchs, Sanguinius was seen as a model of the Emperor's vision for humanity, embodying the ideals of nobility, compassion, and self-sacrifice. This dynamic had profound implications for any custodian who would have been attached as liaison to the Blood Angels, compared to a similar role for the World Eaters. The Emperor's view of Sanguinius is unique among his relationships with the Primarchs. While he loved and respected all of them, at least initially, okay, that's a stretch for Kurz, whatever, his affection for Sanguinius was the level of a personal closeness shared only with Horus. The Emperor saw Sanguinius as the angel, the model for humanity's future. His beauty, charisma, and ability to inspire hope were all reflections of what the Emperor hoped to cultivate in humanity at large. Some interpretations suggest that the Emperor and Horus both thought of Sanguinius as a potential successor to the Emperor. After Horus's fall, this is evinced by Sanguinius's role in defending the imperial palace during the Siege of Terra. Sanguinius was one of the few Primarchs who had a strong gift of prophetic insight and foresight, notably also Conrad Kurz. It is possible that the emperor knew of this. However, where Kurz succumbed to fatalism, Sanguinius sought hope and resisted despair, something the emperor respected deeply, especially if he knew about the prophetic visions. The emperor viewed Sanguinius as someone who could carry the weight of terrible knowledge like himself. This is reflected in how the emperor entrusted Sanguinius with defending Terra and in rescuing the Revenant Legion. The Adeptus Custodes are often depicted in the Black Library as aloof, impartial, entirely loyal to the emperor, and somewhat dismissive or disrespectful to the Primarchs. They were not meant to form attachments to Primarchs, but Sanguinius was the exception. Custodians like Constantine Valor, Captain General of the Custodes, demonstrated respect for Sanguinius, especially demonstrated in their willingness to fight alongside him at the Siege of Terra and then on the Vengeful Spirit. While custodians generally viewed Primarchs as tools, flawed instruments of the emperor's will, Sanguinius was seen as someone worthy of admiration on his own merits. While the Custodes were loyal to the emperor, they recognized that Sanguinius's moral vision was aligned with the emperor's ideals. In contrast, they viewed other Primarchs, especially those more emotionally unstable, like Lorgar, Angron, and Kurz, with suspicion or disdain. Unlike other Primarchs, who were seen as mere tools of the emperor's conquest, Sanguinius was a figure of moral clarity. There was loyalty there, beyond orders. If the Custodes had to take moral direction from a Primarch, Sanguinius would have been one of the few they would trust. This makes for an unique, hypothetical role of a Custodes liaison in the Blood Angels. If a member of the Custodes had been embedded with Sanguinius as a permanent or semi-permanent liaison, the impact on the Blood Angels would have been almost certainly more positive than in any other legion. There would be reinforcement of moral clarity. Sanguinius had a strong moral compass, but he worried about how the emperor viewed his legion. A Custodes, acting as a constant second voice of moral reason, a redundancy, would have been valuable. In moments of doubt, like dealing with the Red Thirst, a Custodian's clarity might have helped to reassure both the Primarch and the Legion that they remained loyal to the Emperor's vision. It would reinforce the idea that the Blood Angels were on the right path, and that their flaws, notably the Red Thirst, did not make them monsters in the eyes of the Emperor, but rather that their striving and their effort was what made him certain that they would not be sanctioned, like the 2nd or 11th legions. A custodian might have given support in managing the Red Thirst. The Red Thirst was a growing problem that Sanguinius never solved. A custodian, an external observer with access to significant influence throughout imperial institutions, might have been able to spot warning signs, advise on treatment or containment, or even bring in outside help without the stigma that the Blood Angels had. The custodian could have helped to destigmatize the curse, reminding the Blood Angels that all Primarchs had their flaws, and many legions had genetic flaws, which did not prevent them from serving in the Great Crusade. It would also provide political support. With a custodian as liaison, the Blood Angels would have had a greater voice among the halls of power on Terra. This might have countered the growing influence of Horus and limited the damage as Horus began to erode the loyalties of other Primarchs. it could have provided Sanguinius with more direct access to the Emperor, perhaps shifting how the Blood Angels viewed their role in the Crusade and the heresy. Meanwhile, as we discussed before, the role of a Custodes liaison in the World Eaters would have been dramatically different from the Blood Angels. There would have been potential benefits, that's true. A custodian could have been a voice of restraint. Angron's growing obsession with the butcher's nails and random violence would have been challenged by a custodian. And unlike Mago, the custodian's authority would be harder to dismiss. Custodes had no political fear of Primarchs, and a custodian could have ultimately ordered Angron to be put into stasis or removed from command when his mental state became too volatile. Whether that would have been followed is a different matter. The custodian would have provided a stable, rational counterpoint to Angron's growing rage and madness. The World Eaters had internal factional struggles, notably between Mago and Karn over the butcher's nails. A custodian as an outside force could have acted as mediator or authority to help resolve these issues without just devolving into internecine violence. If Angron had fallen into a coma or been put into stasis by his librarians, like what happened at Genna, the custodian could have stabilized the Legion and prevented Karn from seizing too much influence. The most crucial turning points in the World Eater's story was the scouring of Genna. If a custodian had been present, he might have been able to prevent the reverse engineering and mass implementation of the butcher's nails. The Custodes, having seen the corruption of chaos before, because they were trained by the Emperor, might have detected the long-term threat posed by this technology, or the growing shadow of Khorne over the Legion. He could have called for reinforcements from Terra, or even requested the Emperor's personal intervention. The roles of a custodian within the Blood Angels and World Eaters would have been fundamentally different. In the Blood Angels, a custodian would serve as a moral anchor, a confidant, and a stabilizing voice. The custodian could help manage the Red Thirst, reinforce loyalty, and offer Sanguinius direct access to the halls of power on Terra. They would be amplifying the good parts of the Blood Angels. In the World Eaters, the custodian's role would be to diminish the bad parts, and there were a lot of them. They would be a restraining force, opposing the spread of the butcher's nails, and mediating internal conflicts. The custodian could stabilize the chain of command, and in extreme cases, they might have been able to remove Angron from power when his rage became uncontrollable and his madness self-evident. Ultimately, while Sanguinius might have embraced a custodian as an ally, Angron would have seen him as an enemy, another symbol of oppression. The custodian could save the World Eaters from Angron, but he would have been able to help the Blood Angels alongside Sanguinius. As with each Primarch and each Legion, excepting the two forgotten Primarchs who died too early, the most important feature in their story is their decision of loyalty versus treason. We have already discussed the great difficulty of a loyalist path for Angron. Had the Emperor made more emotional effort and been able to rescue him from the butcher's nails. And we've discussed the potential for at least a portion of the World Eaters Legion to remain loyal, even in the face of a traitor Angron, had the Emperor and Custodes used closer oversight. Let us now examine potential fault lines, where Sanguinius and the Blood Angels could have allowed despair, the Red Thirst, and rage to overcome their better natures and potentially pointed them towards chaos. up to the Cygnus cluster campaign, let's say. Examining the potential for them to fall requires exploring key moments of vulnerability in their history, their emotional, psychological, and metaphysical struggles. While Sanguinius is seen as the most or second most steadfast, loyalist Primarch, it is clear that, like all his brothers, he had the capacity for doubt, rage, and despair. The Blood Angels struggled with the Red Thirst, which, if exploited, could have served as a bridge to chaos. Kabanda, greater daemon of Khorne, certainly tried. There are key vulnerabilities of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels, and to understand how they could fall, we must identify these points of weakness. Sanguinius's prophetic visions and the weight of foreknowledge. Sanguinius, like Conrad Kurz, had glimpses of his death and the future of the Imperium. The difference was that Kurz embraced despair, believing fate was unchangeable, and this gave him permission to do bad things, while Sanguinius held on to hope, choosing to do good things. If Sanguinius became convinced that fate was inescapable, he might have fallen into despair like Kurz. If his visions were twisted by chaos, perhaps showing him a false image of betrayal by the Emperor, like what daemons showed to Horus, perhaps Sanguinius might see rebellion as the only option to prevent the fall of mankind. What if the Chaos Gods distorted his prophetic visions to show him the Emperor abandoning him, similar to what was shown to Horus? Perhaps this could push Sanguinius to believe that the Imperium's fate was doomed, and that joining Horus was a way to save humanity. We can see some parallels in this idea to some of the canon material regarding the Alpha Legion. Then there's the Red Thirst, an internal curse, but an external threat. The Red Thirst, the genetic flaw in the Blood Legions, gnawed at Sanguinius's warriors and filled them with bloodlust. While Sanguinius was able to control his own urges, the flaw itself was a manifestation of his psychic resonance with the Blood Angels' genetic lineage. Bloodlust and indulgence are the hallmarks of Khorne and Slaanesh, respectively. Khorne tried to twist the Red Thirst into a demand for perpetual slaughter with Kabanda. Perhaps Slaanesh could have exploited the pleasure of victory and the rapture of battle. Imagine if the Chaos Gods had successfully amplified the effects of the Red Thirst in Sanguinius himself during a moment of crisis. Imagine his horror if he had killed one of his brothers or a bunch of civilians or something in a fit of rage. Such an event could have perhaps created a spiral of self-loathing and opened him to chaos's influence. What about isolation and self-doubt? Loneliness of the moral paragon. Sanguinius was one of the few Primarchs who was seen by others as having a clear sense of moral righteousness. Unlike Horus, whose sense of self-importance gradually grew, Angron, who was bound by the nails, or Fulgrim, the ultimate in hubris, Sanguinius took on the burden of his legion's flaws personally. There's pressure there. If Sanguinius ever believed he was being held to an impossible standard, if he felt abandoned or isolated from his brothers, he might have questioned his loyalty. What's he doing this all for? This isolation would be fertile ground for chaos to sow seeds of pride, doubt, or despair. What if, after Horus's promotion to War Master, Sanguinius was made to feel like he had been passed over, despite being seen as the nobler leader? If Horus had mocked him privately, or if he were lied to saying that Horus had mocked him privately, or suggested that the Emperor did not trust him to lead, this could have undermined his confidence and opened him up to resentment. The obvious, most important moment was the Cygnus cluster, the ambush at Cygnus Prime. The Legion was ambushed by chaos daemons of Slaanesh and Khorne, led by the Khornate greater daemon Kabanda, who physically broke Sanguinius and psychically infected the Blood Angels. Sanguinius watched his sons be butchered, his legion suffer from the red thirst, and his defeat nearly led to his death. If Kabanda or Slaanesh had exploited this moment more carefully, perhaps they could have enticed Sanguinius to bargain the power to save his sons in exchange for submission and servitude. If Sanguinius had accepted even for a moment, he might have been overwhelmed. What if Kabanda spared Sanguinius intentionally to try to show him how his sons, the Blood Angels, were destined for bloodlust and violence? If this tactic had been combined with Horus whispering that Sanguinius could save them by rebelling, the Blood Angels perhaps could have been lured into the Horus heresy. And then there's the what if, which has already been explored in fan fiction sometimes. What if Sanguinius was raised by the mutants of Baal Secundus? In this counterfactual scenario, the most obvious effect would be a fundamental change in Sanguinius's views of purity, humanity, and self-worth. The mutant perspective on humanity. If Sanguinius was taught by mutants, he might see mutation as natural rather than something to be purged, which would make a lot of sense with his wings, right? This would put him at odds with the Emperor's ideology regarding human perfection, and might cause the Emperor to view Sanguinius's wings as a cursed mutation rather than a genetic gift. Raised by mutants, isolated from humanity, Sanguinius might even see himself as a freak, and his confidence could shatter. If he internalized this view, he would be far easier prey for chaos, perhaps seeking validation or true acceptance from one of the chaos gods. The Blood Angels' internal battle with the Red Thirst would seem natural to Sanguinius if he believed in the acceptance of flaws without trying to help support them. If mutants taught him that embracing your curse is strength, he might be more willing to encourage leaning into the Red Thirst instead of fighting it. This would make it easier for the Legion to embrace chaos worship. Could Sanguinius have truly fallen? Yes, but he chose not to. Unlike Kors or Angron, Sanguinius had a strong foundation of love, purpose, and belief. If Kabanda had exploited Cygnus Prime better, or if Horus had revealed a false vision of betrayal by the Emperor, Sanguinius could have been more likely to fall. If Sanguinius had been raised by mutants, his views on purity, self-worth, and mutation would shift. His love for the monstrous might have made him reject the Emperor's ideal of humanity. Sanguinius was one of the most emotionally steadfast Primarchs, but that only means he had further to fall. If his prophetic visions were corrupted, his red thirst amplified, and his defeat at Cygnus Prime exploited, Sanguinius might have been more likely to succumb. An upbringing with mutants on Baal Secundus might have shifted his values, making him more receptive to Chaos's promises of acceptance and of self-worth. But he chose to stay loyal instead of any of that. The Blood Angels face a struggle with their nature even still. The red thirst remains a flaw that Chaos still seeks to exploit. Ultimately, it was Sanguinius's hope, love, and compassion that kept him on the side of the Loyalists, and his example which keeps the Blood Angels and their successor chapters on the side of the Loyalists. If his hope had been broken, it's not hard to see a world where the Blood Angels would become Khorne's puppets. How did the actions of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels during the Horus Heresy, prior to the siege of Terra, shape the Blood Angels' later identity? Well, the actions of Sanguinius and the Blood Angels during the Horus Heresy, prior to the siege of Terra and the battle aboard Horus's battle barge, had profound effects on the Legion's post-heresy identity. Their experiences in the Cygnus cluster, their relationship with Sanguinius, and their evolving relationship with the Red Thirst and the Black Rage continue to define them in the 41st millennium. Let's take a look at some key events and how they contributed to their enduring legacy, culture, and spiritual philosophy. Before reaching Terra, the Blood Angels faced several key moments that defined their character. We already mentioned the Cygnus Cluster campaign. The Blood Angels were lured into the Cygnus system by a false set of distress signals orchestrated by Horus. There, they faced an ambush by the daemon hordes of Khorne and Slaanesh, led by the greater daemon Kabanda. During the battle, Kabanda broke Sanguinius in single combat. The Blood Angels suffered catastrophic casualties, with Kabanda intentionally killing a bunch of Blood Angels in order to force Sanguinius to witness his son's deaths. As the Blood Angels were exposed to chaos, the red thirst within them grew more intense. The psychic shock of Sanguinius's physical and emotional pain echoed through the Legion throughout time, stirring up their rage and bloodlust. You should feel free to look up someone else's video for more information about the Black Rage. We're moving on. The image of Sanguinius, their godlike leader, being broken and humiliated by Kabanda, left an indelible mark on the Legion's psyche. Witnessing the fall of a paragon can shatter faith or instill an obsessive desire for revenge and redemption. The Daemons of Chaos directly challenged the Legion's perception of what was real and what was holy. Seeing daemons and being exposed to their psychic influence planted doubts in their minds. This would later shape their spiritual interest in purity and forgiveness and their sense of guilt. Then there's the confrontation with Kabanda at the Battle of Beta Garmon. During the war for the Beta Garmon system, Sanguinius and the Blood Angels fought alongside the Imperial Fists and White Scars. Kabanda, emboldened by his earlier success at Cygnus, returned to confront Sanguinius once again. This time, however, the Blood Angels prevailed, and Sanguinius defeated Kabanda in this second of their 3 combats. This victory, especially after the humiliation at Cygnus, became a mythic moment for the Legion and its successor chapters. The sight of Sanguinius standing victorious over Kabanda reinforced the belief in the redemptive power of suffering. This concept echoes through the later self-conception of the Adeptus Ministorum's cult of martyrdom. From that point forward, the Blood Angels saw combat as a way to purify the soul. This notion would eventually tie into their post-heresy emphasis on ritualized combat, death masks, and visions of spiritual transcendence in battle. Their journey to Terra from Imperium Secundus was very important. The idea of Sanguinius as the heroic protector of Terra became central to the Legion's mythos. The identity as the Angels of Salvation endured well after the heresy, making the Blood Angels and some, not all, of their successor chapters into symbols of hope, beauty, and the salvation of the Imperium. He had pre-battle visions of death, as we talked about before. During the journey to Terra, Sanguinius had vivid visions of his own death at the hands of Horus. He kept these prophecies secret from his legion, though in some sources he did tell Gilliman and Dorn. This narrative of the leader who sees his own doom and fights on anyway became an archetype story that still resonates with the Blood Angels' ritual mythology. They're meditating to draw out or reveal the Black Rage before battle, and the wider Ministorum of the later Imperium. How did these events shape the post-heresy Blood Angels? Well, let's look at the Red Thirst. The genetic flaw known as the Red Thirst existed before the Horus heresy, but its exposure to Gabanta's psychic malice at Cygnus intensified its effects. The Blood Angels after that fought with increasing awareness of their internal struggle for control. The Red Thirst was a metaphor for the inner battle with sin and corruption. This inspired the Legion to develop strict ritual purification rites to ensure that the flaws within them were controlled. The Red Thirst is a literal and spiritual hunger for violence and control, reflecting the broader themes of Christian penitence, atonement, and the battle with sin, which are sprinkled throughout Warhammer 40,000, just as little flavorings. The Blood Angels see battle as a form of personal redemption, perhaps similar to some of the Crusaders in the Crusades of the Second Millennium. I hope I'm getting the dates right. All right, so the Black Rage. The echoes of Sanguinius' death at Horus's hands remain in the collective unconscious of the Blood Angels' gene seed. During battle, some Blood Angels experience visions of that moment, believing they are reliving their Primarch's death. This is usually exposed the night before battle in ritual. This post-heresy phenomenon has become sacred. The Blood Angels see those afflicted by the Black Rage as martyrs of Sanguinius, the Death Company, who symbolically relive the ultimate moment of sacrifice. The Black Rage reinforces the idea that the Blood Angels are martyrs by nature, and so those affected by it, sent into the Death Company, die in battle, earning glory and releasing their souls from torment. The Ministorum has the triptych of saints directly under the Emperor: Thor, Dolan, Sanguinius. Sanguinius is their messiah figure, celebrated in the Sanguinala. His self-sacrifice and noble death at the Siege of Terra are reminiscent of Christ-like figures in myth and religion. His martyrdom is seen as an act of redemption for the sins of his legion within the Blood Legions. After the heresy, Sanguinius was not just seen as a Primarch, but the Primarch, the saint figure. Statues of him were raised everywhere, and his death masks became the centerpiece of Blood Angels ritual. The Blood Angels are one of the few first founding Space Marine chapters to have a spiritual philosophy. This comes from their deep reflection on purity, sin, suffering, and transcendence. Their artistic tendencies are not merely aesthetic, but are linked to the belief that beauty overcomes darkness. Most of the others have more or less a, Ministorum, but also emperors maybe not fully divine? Whatever. Leave that to the Inquisition. There's the relationship with the Inquisition and Custodes post-heresy. The Blood Angels' genetic flaws are closely monitored. They face constant suspicion, especially since their flaws are reminiscent of those that drove the World Eaters to Khorne. To combat this scrutiny, the Blood Angels and many of their successor chapters emphasize ritual purity and carefully curate their image as protectors and angels. Their self-control becomes a central part of their identity, mirroring the theme of penance and atonement. The long-term legacy of the heresy for the Blood Angels is thus complicated. They were hurt by the Black Rage, but they were redeemed by the sacrifice of Sanguinius. The pre-Siege of Terra Horus Heresy experiences of the Blood Angels forged them into a legion obsessed with redemption, beauty, and control. And in the post-Siege of Terra, the Red Thirst and Black Rage became metaphors for the battle against sin, echoing real-world themes of Christian martyrdom. Their devotion to Sanguinius as a messiah figure in universe solidified their chapter as having an identity of redemption through suffering and sacrifice. During the Siege of Terra, and then during the fight aboard Horus's flagship, but before the actual duel with Horus, the actions of Sanguinius and his legion draw from multiple different sources of inspiration, notably Roland from The Song of Roland. Sanguinius's actions are steeped in mythological, literary, and religious symbolism. His role as a martyr, angelic redeemer, and tragic hero draws heavily from the Song of Roland, Christian theology, and Greek tragic heroes. Each moment in this narrative builds upon the legacy of earlier trials, like at Cygnus Prime, and foreshadows the enduring themes of sacrifice, fate, and redemption, which define the Blood Angels into the following millennia. Let's take a look at some of the pivotal moments, identify possible literary and mythological parallels, and analyze what these moments reveal about Sanguinius's character. The obvious one, the big one, the defense of the Eternity Gate. As War Master Horus's forces breached the Imperial Palace, Sanguinius and the forces under his command become the de facto last line of defense. The Eternity Gate is the most critical entry point, and he chooses to stand his ground with his Blood Angels, the Imperial Army, Mechanicum forces, and other allies. Mythological comparisons here abound. Roland at Roncesvalles, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Like Roland at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, Sanguinius holds the rear guard, the last line against overwhelming odds. Roland famously blew his horn, his oliphant, to call for help right at the end, knowing it will cost him his life, just as Sanguinius knew that his stand at the gate was a battle he could not win alone. Leonidas at Thermopylae. Sanguinius echoes the king of Sparta at the hot gates to delay an overwhelming larger force. The gate imagery is deliberate, placed here by Games Workshop specifically for these comparisons, with both figures choosing to sacrifice themselves to give their people time to achieve a larger victory. In Sanguinius's case, maintaining the fortress against an overwhelming attack. The thematic symbolism here of the guardian at the threshold. We see the role of threshold guardianship in mythological figures like Saint Michael, the defender of heaven's gates, or Charon, the ferryman of souls in Greek myth. He stands between life and death, symbolically and literally between salvation and damnation. By holding the line, by defeating both Kabanta and Angron in quick succession, Sanguinius accepts his role as a sacrificial figure, mirroring the Christian concept of martyrdom, a good shepherd willing to lay down his life for his flock. Yes, I'm mixing metaphors here. Deal with it. The boarding of the vengeful spirit. The Emperor, Sanguinius, Rogaldorn, and a bunch of custodes who ultimately did nothing, teleported to Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, to confront and ideally kill the War Master. But the teleportation scatters them. Sanguinius finds himself isolated aboard the vessel, facing an array of demonic terrors alone. The mythological finding here is the descent into the underworld of the hero's journey. Like Orpheus, Aeneas, or Dante, Sanguinius moved through an infernal, surreal environment filled with unnatural horrors. His journey through the vengeful spirit is like the descent into Hades, or hell, of mythology and literature, where he confronts visions, chaos-born nightmares, and, ultimately, finds his own destiny. We can also see in here the temptation of Christ. The isolation of Sanguinius echoes Christ's 40 days in the desert, where he was tempted by Satan. Sanguinius, like Christ, faces an internal struggle as chaos tempts him with survival, power, and vengeance, but he rejects these offers, reinforcing his role as a model of spiritual purity. The theme here is that of the hero alone in the labyrinth, like Theseus facing against the Minotaur. Sanguinius faces the darkness and terror of Horus's worship alone, the isolated hero navigating the enemy's stronghold, a classic motif of the monomyth, the hero's journey. This is the moment when the hero is stripped of all allies and must confront himself and his fate. Prophetic clarity is the point. His actions at this point mirror the concept of foresight as burden. Unlike many mythological heroes, Sanguinius knows his fate. He will die at Horus's hands. His acceptance of this fate echoes Achilles in the Iliad, who also marches towards certain death with full knowledge of his doom. Let's take a little bit more in-depth look at his duel with Kabanda. Kabanda, the greater daemon of Khorne, reappears at the Battle of the Eternity Gate and is decisively beaten by Sanguinius. Their third and final duel, following their encounters at Cygnus Prime and Beta Garmon. We might compare this from the Song of Roland with Roland versus Farragut. The hero Roland fought a near-immortal giant named Farragut in a final personal duel. Sanguinius and Kabanda's ongoing rivalry, their enmity, evokes the pattern of a heroic nemesis or shadow self as a recurring villain. Or David versus Goliath. Like the biblical David, Sanguinius faces a massive, physically overwhelming opponent, but not just once, not even just 3 times, 4 times if you count his fight with Angron, but he prevails due to his purity and spiritual strength, not brute force. This is the theme of confronting the shadow, a classic motif from Jungian psychology. I hope I'm pronounced that word right. Kabanda represents the embodiment of Sanguinius' own violent potential, the red thirst, and Angron embodies his potential to gain power through falling. To defeat them both is to master his own inner self and to understand himself better. Having defeated his shadow self, Sanguinius becomes the purified, ideal version of himself. This is why, when he later faces Horus, his spiritual clarity and certainty are absolute. Yes, he's not at his physical best then. That's true. But that doesn't matter. He's at his spiritually most powerful, his transcendent self. Sanguinius, notably, is the first to face Horus in single combat at the Siege of Terra. He faces him knowing full well he will die, but still chooses to engage. Despite being overwhelmed, Sanguinius leaves a lasting mark. He inflicts a single wound on Horus, or depending on canon, a weakness in his armor, which ultimately opens the path for the Emperor to prevail. The mythological comparison here there's a few. There's Roland's last stand. Like Roland, who blows his Oliphant in defiance before dying, Sanguinius makes his last stand against an overwhelming force. Both characters are aware that their deaths are certain, but they face them with resolve. Like the Passion of Christ, Sanguinius' death is deeply symbolic of sacrificial martyrdom, the crucifixion. Sanguinius faces Horus, a corrupting, satanic figure, and his death becomes a catalyst for the emperor's victory. Christ being a non-violent figure makes the whole comparison less helpful metaphorically, but whatever. There's the theme of the wounded redeemer here. By inflicting a wound upon Horus, Sanguinius becomes a redeemer figure while himself suffering wounds. He dies, but his act allows the emperor to prevail. This mirrors the concept of the suffering servant in Christian theology, where one person suffering, in this case Sanguinius being killed, redeems others, in this case the emperor achieving victory. And death as apotheosis. His death elevates him from mere Primarch to a galaxy-wide symbol of hope and divine grace. In death, Sanguinius becomes a mythic figure, worshipped as a saint. His visions of his own death parallel the concept of a hero who willingly goes to his fate, like Achilles, and his transcendence through that death into an immortal hero likewise brings us to mind Achilles. Sanguinius' journey during the siege of Terra is a mythic arc about prophecy, sacrifice, and redemption. His choices echo those of Roland, Achilles, and Christ as he walks knowingly towards his death to protect his people. By mastering his inner rage and embracing his prophetic fate, Sanguinius exemplifies the idea of a hero who dies so others may live. His death aboard the Vengeful Spirit permanently elevates him as a messianic figure for his sons, shaping the identity of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters forever. The Christ allegory breaks down a bit during the duel with Horus, due to the warrior versus pacifist difference, but the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane and the temptation of Christ remain good parallels. Regarding the dealing of a weakening wound to Horus, we might instead compare him with Fingolfin in J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion fighting Morgoth, or with Vax Holzer from David Fintuk's Prisoner's Hope fighting against, spoiler alert, a fleet of aliens. This moment, Sanguinius wounding Horus before his own death, is a pivotal act with deep symbolic resonance. It shows the idea that even in defeat, a heroic figure can leave a lasting, critical impact. The concept is shown in Fingolfin's duel with Morgoth in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, and Vax Holzer's battle in David Fintuk's Prisoner's Hope, where they face impossible odds in order to allow someone else to gain victory. Each of these moments carries unique thematic weight, but they all emphasize the enduring legacy of the hero's defiance of overwhelming evil. Let's compare and contrast. The wounding of Horus. Sanguinius faces Horus in his final duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Horus, now fully engulfed by chaos, is at the height of his power. Sanguinius knows that he will not live, but he knows that he will win, as his prophetic visions have already shown him his death. But despite his foreknowledge, he faces Horus alone and wins by inflicting a critical wound before being killed. Accounts differ slightly, but most sources describe Sanguinius striking Horus on the chest or inflicting a small but lasting wound or a weakness in his armor or something. Some interpretations suggest that this wound may have slowed Horus, while others suggest that they made an opportunity for the emperor to strike the killing blow later. Like a death curse from myth, Sanguinius's wound inflicted upon Horus is not immediately decisive, but it symbolically marks Horus. The wound becomes a physical manifestation of Horus's moral corruption and the inevitability of his defeat. Sanguinius knows he is destined to die, but he still chooses to fight with everything he has. This shows the classic role of the tragic hero, a figure aware of their doom, but unwilling to surrender to despair. By wounding Horus, Sanguinius transforms from mere martyr to avenging angel. His bloodied legacy remains part of the Blood Angels' ethos, reinforcing their belief in sacrifice with purpose. Meanwhile, in the Silmarillion, Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor elves, confronts Morgoth directly at the gates of Angband, the fortress of evil in Middle-earth. Fingolfin challenges the Dark Lord to single combat, despite knowing it is a hopeless battle. His decision is driven by a sense of honor, despair, and defiance after his people have suffered immensely. Despite being vastly outmatched, Fingolfin manages to strike 7 wounds on Morgoth using his sword Ringil. Each wound causes Morgoth incredible pain, and one of the wounds leaves Morgoth permanently crippled, forcing him to limp for the rest of his existence. Unlike Sanguinius' wound on Horus, which has symbolic and tactical impact, Fingolfin's wounds have more of a literal physical consequence. Morgoth is permanently lamed, and for the rest of his reign in Middle-earth, his powers are visibly diminished. The symbolic mark is a literal one. This fight, of course, also rhymes with that of Achilles versus Hector in the Iliad, and echoes Odin's self-sacrifice for wisdom. By enduring pain for the sake of his people, he becomes a figure of sacrificial courage. Fingolfin's death, like Sanguinius, becomes a rallying cry for his people. His death is not in vain, as it marks Morgoth as vulnerable. It reinforces the idea that even the mightiest evil can be hurt. Like Sanguinius' role as a guardian of the threshold at the Eternity Gate, Fingolfin acts as the last bulwark of defiance against a vast, all-consuming darkness. Alright, you should all read the Seafort Saga. All 7 of those books. 6 of those 7 books are really great, and book 5 is pretty good. So, spoiler alerts. In David Fientook's Prisoner's Hope, 3rd book in the series, Vax Holzer is a commanding officer and sometime friend to the protagonist, Nicholas Seafort. During a desperate moment, Holzer assumes command to face an overwhelming alien fleet. His last stand is a moment of profound courage, knowing he will die, but hoping to buy time for others, notably Seafort, to escape, and hoping to leave a lasting injury to the enemy fleet so that Earth might survive. Instead of a physical blow to a singular foe, Vax Holzer inflicts strategic harm on the enemy fleet with, spoiler alert, a nuclear strike, causing serious damage to the enemy forces. This moment serves as a wound to the larger foe, as Holzer's sacrifice gives humanity a fighting chance. Unlike the wounds on a single person of Horus or Morgoth, the wound here is tactical against an army, against a navy. Holzer cripples the enemy navy, bringing an enormous propaganda victory to humanity and shifting the strategic advantage back towards humanity by dealing so many casualties to the enemy fleet. Like Sanguinius, Holzer fills the role of a mentor who dies so that others may live. This fits the Obi-Wan Kenobi archetype. The mentor's death becomes the catalyst for the protagonist's growth. Holzer's self-sacrifice is remembered by Nicholas Seafort, shaping his own journey as a leader. This is similar to how the Blood Angels are forever shaped by the death of Sanguinius, as his moment of defiance is woven into their doctrines and sense of duty. While Sanguinius, Fingolfin, and Vax Holzer exist in very different fictional settings, their struggles share several key points. Each one of them knows that they will die, but they continue to fight. This makes them the tragic hero archetype. Each inflicts a lasting wound on the great evil that they face. Sanguinius weakening Horus, Fingolfin crippling Morgoth, and Holzer causing a great number of casualties to the alien fleet, causing loss of momentum as well as loss of numbers. Each figure becomes a mythic symbol after death. For Sanguinius, this leads to the Red Grail cult of the Blood Angels. For Fingolfin, his fight is memorialized in elven songs. For Holzer, his influence shapes Captain Seafort into being a better leader. Ultimately, spoiler alert, leading to Captain Seafort's actions at the end of Fisherman's Hope, the 4th book. The wounding of evil by a doomed hero is a widely used story arc. In Sanguinius, we see echoes of Fingolfin's brave defiance and Holzer's last stand. The enduring lesson is that even when evil seems unstoppable, an act of defiance can ripple through time. This legacy becomes a moral compass for those who survive. The Blood Angels continue to see themselves as guardians of humanity, much like their gene father Sanguinius, whose last blow against Horus still resonates in their hearts. And there the story of Sanguinius ends, with his death, never to return to the land of the living. You may have noticed in my last video I stopped my discussion of Angron quite early, not going into great detail about his participation at the battles at Istvan or in the Ultramar Segmentum or Terra, not discussing his later conflicts against the Imperium, such as the First War for Armageddon. The reason is simple. Angron stopped growing and changing. There's nothing more to talk about. His character is the same midway through the Great Crusade as it is after 10,000 years of daemonhood. Such is his damnation. He is doomed to eternal stagnation in his servitude to Khorne. Meanwhile, by the loyalty and example of Sanguinius, the Blood Angels and their successor chapters continue to grow and improve and change in ways the World Eaters never can. The 10,000-year legacy of the Blood Angels following the Horus Heresy reflects a complex evolution of their character, doctrine, and role within the Imperium. While their identity was initially shaped by the martyrdom of Sanguinius, it was since tested by the Red Thirst, the Black Rage, and their ongoing struggle for spiritual and physical purity. Their journey highlights the tension between angelic nobility and monstrous fury, much like the broader human condition depicted throughout the Imperium in Warhammer 40k. Let's talk about the key themes, pivotal events, and enduring lessons about the development of the Blood Angels in the post-heresy Imperium. The Red Thirst and the Black Rage. They internalized not only Sanguinius' fights against Kabanda, but his death at the hands of Horus. The deaths of Sanguinius and Horus became defining moments in the psychic and spiritual landscape of the Imperium. During the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius' death created a lasting psychic scar on his legion. We can take a look at their two afflictions. The initial one, the Red Thirst, a growing insatiable craving for blood, like into vampirism, possibly tied to the psychic echoes forward and backward in time of Kabanda's fight against Sanguinius. And then the Black Rage, a berserk fury where affected Blood Angels believe they are Sanguinius, reliving his final battle with Horus. While all Blood Angels feel the call of the Red Thirst, the Black Rage is only affects certain Marines. It's more selective. Those who succumb to it on the night before battle are moved into the Death Company, a unit which fights with absolute ferocity, knowing they will die. Unlike the World Eaters, who embraced madness, the Blood Angels strive for self-mastery, fighting their curse instead of surrendering to it. The formalization of the Death Company allowed the Blood Angels to control the Black Rage in a useful way during battle, rather than be destroyed by it. By turning these afflicted warriors into living weapons, they transform a curse into an asset. The Red Grail is used by the Blood Angels in the Sanguinary priesthood, whose rituals sustain their purity and attempt to stave off the red thirst. The symbol of the Red Grail echoes the themes of sacrifice and Eucharistic ritual, reinforcing the religious dimension of their chapter and their successor chapters. The spiritual symbolism here is that the red thirst is an allegory for original sin, while the Black Rage mirrors the experience of being haunted by one's ancestral trauma. Unlike the World Eaters, then, the Blood Angels see themselves accurately as redeemable beings capable of overcoming their flaws. Then there was the post-heresy reorganization under the Codex Astartes. After the Horus Heresy, Robute Guilliman enforced the Codex Astartes, splitting legions into 1,000-man chapters. The Blood Angels became a first founding chapter, with their successors forming the Bloodline chapters, like the Flesh Terrors, the Angels in Carmine, specifically not the Blood Ravens, despite the name. While they adopted much of the Codex Astartes, the Blood Angels did make key deviations. The Death Company violates the Codex by creating a non-standard unit. The role of sanguinary priests as spiritual leaders and healers has no direct equivalent in the Codex. Usually apothecary and chaplain are separated. They must often operate far from centralized support, so they have a semi-reliant, semi-autonomous structure. Not quite to the extent of the Iron Hands. The Blood Angels' deviations from the Codex have been tolerated, likely due to the immense political weight they have due to the veneration of Sanguinius as a saintly figure. Their successors, like the Flesh Terrors, often exhibit extreme instability. The Flesh Terrors constantly walk the line between loyalty and uncontrollable fury. They're the closest that the Imperium gets to the Word Bearers. They reflect the precarious state of the Blood Angels' genetic legacy. Their identity as guardians of culture and beauty remains intact, with Blood Angels maintaining a strong emphasis on art, sculpture, and architecture. The preservation of beauty in a decaying galaxy is both a spiritual duty and a psychological shield against the horrors and madness of war. In 10,000 years, the Blood Angels, of course, have participated in any number of campaigns and actions, but certain pivotal events have shaped the character of the chapter and cemented its legacy. In various battles, Chaplain Astrath the Grim has played a key role in leading the Death Company. These battles test the balance between using the Black Rage as a tool and maintaining control. The Battle of Baal against the Tyranids in M41. The Blood Angels faced a massive Tyranid hive fleet of Leviathan, directly attacking Baal. They were nearly overwhelmed until the arrival of Primarch Robute Guilliman with the Indomitus Crusade and Astartes Primaris reinforcements. This event introduced the Primaris Space Marines into the Blood Angels. Unlike earlier Marines, there is some thought that maybe the Primaris were more resistant to the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. offering additional hope for the Blood Angels' genetic future. The survival of Baal against the impossible Tyranid odds reflects the enduring martyrdom complex of the chapter. They see themselves as eternal guardians willing to die for something greater. Among the cultural and spiritual evolution of the Blood Angels, we can see the Sanguinala celebrated across the Imperium. It's most notable in the Arbites books. The Blood Angel's identity revolves around Sanguinius as this Christ-like figure. The Sanguinala, a festival held across the Imperium, commemorates his sacrifice. His role as a martyr, visionary, prophet, and a redeemer mirrors Christian theology, with echoes of the agony in the garden and the passion of Christ. The Sanguinary Guard serves as an I don't know about unique, but at least an elite unit, resembling angels with golden wings, symbolizing the nobility and perfection of Sanguinius. Their appearance conveys not only physical might, but also spiritual purity. They are warrior saints, icons of everything the Blood Angels strive to be. Unlike the flesh terrors who lean into their rage, the Blood Angels emphasize self-improvement, striving for aesthetic and spiritual perfection. Their obsession with art, beauty, and music shows their yearning for something beyond bloodshed. This reflects the idea that art is a form of salvation, a counter to the nihilism of war. With the resurrection of Rebute Gilliman, the Blood Angels have become more closely tied to the Imperial Reformation project. The inclusion of Primaris Marines into their ranks signals a potential cure for their genetic flaws. The process of transforming original Marines into Primaris Marines, the Rubicon Primaris, is symbolic of a spiritual rebirth so much as it is a physical change. It represents the idea that even in an age of war, transformation and ascension are possible. Chapter Master Dante, one of the oldest living Marines, perhaps the oldest not entombed in a dreadnought, has become a mythic figure. He serves as a bridge between the age of Sanguinius and the era Indomitus, at least metaphorically, acting as a living embodiment of Sanguinius's dream. His prolonged lifespan echoes the idea of an eternal guardian who never surrenders his post. The Blood Angels' story is one of struggle, beauty, and hope in the face of despair. Unlike the World Eaters, they do not surrender to madness. Instead, they strive for redemption. Their martyrdom complex and their belief in spiritual transcendence echo the story of Christ and the saints, constantly seeking salvation in a galaxy of eternal war. Their quest for perfection continues. Let us imagine that the Emperor set up a system in which Primarchs switch legions in order to allow them to learn from their nephews, and in order for the Legion to learn from a second Primarch. This would need to start at a time somewhat after each Legion is united with their original Primarch, have a predetermined temporary time span, and ideally start early, after they were able to make a mark on their Legion, but before they're calcified. Let's call this the Fellowship Program. We're going to look at this for a lot of different Primarchs, so fucking pay attention, asshole. There are 4 scenarios we shall examine. 1. Switch leadership. The Primarchs just switch legions for a time and do as they think best. 2nd, we'll discuss a little bit. Rank, but not the highest rank. Perhaps the Primarch might have 1,000 Marines of the new Legion under his direct command, but would therefore at first have several equals in rank, and he would be ultimately under the command of the Legion Master, at least for a while. 3rd, we'll discuss this possibility, the observer status. No formal rank. The legions would be led by Legion Masters until the return of the original Primarch. Fourth, we're going to talk about this one a lot. Full immersion. The Emperor casts a psychic glamour, which leads each Primarch to temporarily forget who they are and prevents their identity from being seen except by the Custodes. Each Primarch is then inserted into their brother's legion with the initial rank of Battle Brother. The legions would be led by a legion master until the return of their original Primarch, and a custodian would accompany each legion to ensure that the glamour can be lifted if there's urgent need. Let's say that the Blood Angels and World Eaters would be paired for this program, a fellowship. We're going to look at the potential results for both Primarch and Legion for each of the 4 scenarios. The reason why I'm picking these 2 legions is that they're often perceived as reflections of one another. They're nobility versus savagery, control versus abandon, the angel versus the beast. This is not to say that this will be ultimately the fellowship that we end up deciding is the best option. We got a lot of other Primarchs to think through. So, switch leadership. The Primarchs just switch legions. See how they can do. Let's say that Sanguinius leads the World Eaters and Angron leads the Blood Angels for 100 years. Each assumes full authority over the other's legion and is empowered to make sweeping reforms as they see fit. Okay, Sanguinius leading the World Eaters could be very important. The initial impact would be to calm the storm. Sanguinius's focus on self-control, honor, beauty, and nobility would lead to efforts to counteract the World Eaters' violent tendencies. Sanguinius would certainly stop them from implanting the butcher's nails into new recruits and would likely attempt to wean existing Marines off their reliance of the butcher's nails, seeing them accurately as a source of spiritual corruption. His methods might mirror his earlier efforts with the Blood Angels, focusing on art, ritual, self-reflection, maybe mentorship under other legions. Without the Butcher's Nails to fuel their berserker rages, some World Eaters might feel adrift or lesser than those who had them, while others might find purpose in Sanguinius's vision of nobility. There would certainly be conflict with Angron's loyalists, such as Karn. Some of the Terran-born World Eaters who had fought under Legion Master Gear, a known opponent of the Nails before Angron was introduced, might find it easier to embrace Sanguinius's leadership. But die-hard loyalists to Angron like Karn would see Sanguinius as an unworthy outsider and resist his changes. Angron leading the Blood Angels would be a problem. Angron's emphasis on unrestrained warfare, refusal to play politics, and disdain for diplomacy would clash with the Blood Angels' ideals of honor and beauty and order. His leadership would certainly encourage more direct assaults and brutal campaigns, killing so many civilians. Angron would likely perceive the Blood Angels' red thirst as a lesser form of his own legion's butcher's nails. Given his own suffering, he might see their condition as pathetic weakness, and he would feel frustrated by their refusal to embrace it as a source of strength. He might, over time, lean into the red thirst as an outlet for the Blood Angels' rage, mirroring his own experience with the Nails. This would mean that he would be in a cultural tug of war with his new legion, which had spent so much time learning honor and beauty and art and order to resist it. The Blood Angels, especially the Sanguinary Guard and their spiritual leaders, would see Angron as a blunt instrument incapable of grasping the spiritual depth of their mission. Unlike the World Eaters, who might be forced into line by fear of Angron, the Blood Angels would be more resistant. Okay, rank, but not the highest rank. An inferior idea, but we're still going to talk about it. Each Primarch is placed in a position of mid-level authority of their legion. They lead a portion of the legion, but they have superiors, they have equals, they got to follow orders. If Sanguinius were a commander within the World Eaters, under probably Karn, being placed under a Legion Master would be humbling for Sanguinius, but he would accept it as a learning opportunity. If the Legion Master was a proponent of the Butcher's Nails, which is likely because he'd be chosen by the outgoing Angron, Sanguinius might experience the growing pain of watching brutality spread under his watch, creating a sense of martyrdom and sacrifice. Over time, his influence on his subordinates might be similar to his impact on the early Blood Angels, guiding them through personal growth and self-reflection. But this would be opposed by all the rest of the World Eaters around those under his command. Those under Sanguinius's command would experience his patience, compassion, and strategic brilliance as examples to live up to. So a small core of World Eaters might begin to see an alternative path to honor and glory as opposed to mindless rage. However, everyone else in the Legion, especially whoever was in charge, like Karn, would see Sanguinius as soft and condescending, despite his immense martial prowess. Without full control over the Legion, Sanguinius would be unable to implement reforms. If Angron were a commander within the Blood Angels, being made subordinate to the Legion Master, it would fill him with even more fury and resentment, if that's possible. Angron's disdain for diplomacy, honor, and soft ideals like art and beauty and patience would create immediate conflict with the Blood Angels' established culture. Over time, he might come to respect their skill as warriors, but his view of their culture would likely remain dismissive. The Blood Angels under his direct command would be taught to wield their rage in new ways. While the Blood Angels normally strive to master their fury, Angron would encourage them to use it as a weapon. This might result in the rise of two ideological camps within the Blood Angels. Those who embrace Angron's methods and become more akin to the later Flesh Terrors chapter, and those who remain loyal to Sanguinius's ideals. Okay, here's the rough one. Observer status. I have included it for completion, but it would be bad. It would not be a good option for any pair of Primarchs. I'm just going to bring it up. So each Primarch would live among the opposite legion as an observer and would fight alongside them, but would not be under command of anybody. The legion would be led by his legion master. If Sanguinius were an observer in the World Eaters, he would experience powerlessness, forced to watch brutality without being able to stop it. He might adopt a role as a spiritual guide for individuals in the World Eaters Legion, offering quiet counsel to Marines struggling with the nails. This would be a period of immense grief, humility, and learning patience for Sanguinius, further developing his martyrdom archetype. The impact on the World Eaters would be limited. New philosophies might develop among Marines drawn to Sanguinius's moral clarity. Over 100 years, some Marines might see him as a source of divine inspiration. The World Eaters would become a little bit more ideologically diverse, as factions would form around the response to Sanguinius's presence. Angron, as an observer in the Blood Angels, would just be so unhappy all the time. He would be forced to confront his discomfort with inaction and subtlety. And historically, how Angron has responded to discomfort has been violence. On the other hand, he might experience a measure of peace for the first time since he'd run away from his legion, which could lead to self-reflection. He would probably see the Blood Angel's obsession with art as an affront to what he thinks of as true war, hardening his belief in his own ideology. He would not be improved by the experience. The Blood Angels, meanwhile, especially those dealing with the Red Thirst, might see Angron as a cautionary tale, but others might be drawn to his example, especially seeing him fight as an individual alongside them. Due to his immense martial prowess, they may see in him a grim heroism. Okay, full immersion. This is the big one. We're going to talk about it a bunch with a bunch of different legions. Each Primarch immersed as a simple battle brother in the other legion, believing themselves to be mere marines. Sanguinius, as a battle brother in the World Eaters, would have a complex reaction, seeing the effect of the butcher snails on his brother marines that he would serve and fight alongside of them, would give Sanguinius a deeper empathy for Angron's plight. As his martial skill shone through and his obvious leadership was seen, he would certainly rise through the ranks, recognized for his abilities, even though no one would know that it was him. Upon regaining his memories at the end of the time, Sanguinius would be driven to try to find or create a cure for the butcher's nails, knowing how horrible it was for all the people around him. The impact on the World Eaters would be a good one, I feel. His presence as a fellow brother would encourage more introspection. A group within the World Eaters might form, taking on his innate values of control and nobility and honor, forming a cultural countercurrent to Angron's aggression and dominance. If Angron were a battle brother in the Blood Angels, without the weight of command, he might experience something he rarely did: camaraderie and brotherhood. Deep in his subconscious, it might remind him of his gladiator brothers. His fighting spirit would stand out, and he might rise to prominence as an elite warrior. He may indeed regain his role as a leader. Upon regaining his memories, he might return to his legion, the World Eaters, with a deeper understanding of fellowship and love, traits that he lacked. The impact on the Blood Angels, they would be very sad, very worried also, to have their Primarch gone. But a new warrior cult might emerge around this mysterious young Marine, inspired by his prowess and raw power. They would have this pure, undiluted madman berserker in battle alongside them. The question is, would he be controllable and disciplinable outside of battle? Overall, the Legion Fellowship, in either the switch leadership or full immersion style, would have drastic effects on both Primarchs and both legions. Sanguinius might humanize the World Eaters, but Angron might expose the repressed brutality in the Blood Angels. Their interactions would embody themes of redemption, control, and fate, core concepts to both of their personalities. Not just for the specific pair of Primarchs, but for the idea of the full immersion fellowship in general. Let's think about the effect on the legions of letting them know that their Primarch has been swapped under glamour, compared and contrasted with the effect of telling them nothing of the sort and just saying their Primarchs have been withdrawn to Terra temporarily for a special project. If you inform the legions, then they might have pride in the experiment. Knowing that their Primarch was serving in a rival legion could foster pride, as it would highlight that their own culture and own methods are significant enough to teach and challenge another Primarch serving in their own legion. This transparency could create a sense of camaraderie with the other legion that they were switching with. The knowledge that both legions were participating in a grand experiment ordered by the Emperor, the knowledge that any battle brother you speak with from that other legion might be your Primarch, might soften rivalries and encourage mutual respect. The Legion would likely scrutinize their temporary replacement Primarch's actions and judge whether they were living up to their real or original Primarch's standards. But only if they figured it out, The temporary Primarch might feel pressure to prove their worth and avoid deviating too far from their new legion's established norms and practices. Under the switch leadership style, there's challenges to the temporary leadership. Some legionnaires might resist the temporary Primarch's leadership, feeling that no outsider could truly understand or embody their legion's identity. This could lead to friction, passive resistance, or even outright resistance. But when the temporary Primarch proved themselves through valor and wisdom, it could earn the respect of the Legion and create a lasting bond between them. Once it was revealed who the full immersion Marines were, which ones were secretly Primarchs, the legions might celebrate the experiment's successes, and they might develop an intense but healthier pride based on their respective Primarchs' deeds and achievements in their other legion during the swap. The story of the swap would likely become part of both legions' shared mythology, fostering respect and a sense of shared purpose rooted in the Emperor's grand design. If you keep the Fellowship a secret under the full immersion idea, it could be a problem for Legion morale and culture. If they're just told that their Primarch has been withdrawn to Terra for 100 years for a special project, Marines might feel abandoned or uncertain about their future. They might speculate about the reasons for the absence, ranging from some special honor to technical skill in some certain Primarchs anyway, to punishment, because, they all remembered what happened to the 2nd and 11th Primarchs. Well, no, they didn't, but they remembered that they once remembered. There would be a focus on meritocracy, I feel. The absence of a known Primarch might push the Legion to focus on collective effort and the leadership of their Legion Master, fostering a meritocratic spirit in the short term. But, on the other hand, without knowing that he was serving alongside them, the Legion would judge the disguised, glamoured Primarch purely on their deeds and personality, free from any preconceived notions or expectations that he might be a Primarch. A disguised Primarch starting as a battle brother would experience the Legion's culture from the ground up, allowing them to form genuine connections with the rank and file, and gain an insider's perspective on the Legion's strengths and flaws. Revealing the truth only after the Fellowship would cause an enormous impact. The Legion might feel awe and pride in having unknowingly hosted and fought alongside a Primarch, and the revelation would solidify their bond with the other Legion. But some Marines might feel manipulated or betrayed upon learning the truth, especially if they had grown attached to the disguised Primarch and were now forced to see them leave, or if they felt that their own original Primarch had been changed in ways they didn't agree with. The lack of foreknowledge could prevent the temporary Primarch from being seen as an interloper or a threat to the Legion's identity, ensuring that any cultural exchange happened naturally and organically, rather than as a top-down imposition. Both approaches have unique strengths and potential pitfalls, informing the legions creates transparency and pride. And yes, it might invite resistance and tension, that's true. But keeping the fellowship a secret, while it would foster organic growth and unbiased relationships, it would risk feelings of betrayal at their Primarch being gone for no reason. While the best choice for any individual pair of legions likely depends on the personalities of the Primarchs and the cultures of the legions involved, you wouldn't be able to do both styles throughout the various legions. Because if you told one pair, yeah, your guys are swapping, they're under glamour, you'll find out who they are in 100 years, then you can't go to a different pair of legions and say, oh yeah, I've called your Primarchs back for a secret mission, because they'll just immediately understand that they're under glamour. Anyway, counterfactual stuff. How might Sanguinius have contributed to the Imperium for domestic administration and governance? Sanguinius's combination of charisma, compassion, and foresight suggests that he could have been a remarkable contributor to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance in either a post-Crusade era, had he lived, or had he been assigned such instead of just being on the front lines. His character traits and leadership style would allow him to excel in areas requiring unity, inspiration, and the cultivation of hope in a vast and often brutal galaxy. Perhaps he would be good in a position of diplomatic leadership. Sanguinius's natural charisma and empathy made him an exceptional mediator and leader. He could inspire loyalty and cooperation among disparate factions, uniting the Imperium's myriad worlds under a shared vision. He might serve as an ambassador to mediate disputes between planetary governors, or forge alliances with independent human realms, preparatory to annexing them into the Imperium. He might oversee the integration of newly compliant worlds into the Imperium, ensuring a balance between cultural preservation and imperial unity. Sanguinius's presence was often described as uplifting and transformative. He had a profound ability to inspire hope, even in dire circumstances. That suggests a couple of possible roles. He may have been able to lead morale-building campaigns across the Imperium, particularly in war-torn or rebellious sectors, where his angelic appearance and reputation for mercy could pacify dissent and reinvigorate faith in the Emperor's vision. He might be able to establish cultural institutions or imperial traditions that emphasize unity and shared purpose, creating a lasting legacy for future generations. His compassion for the common people set Sanguinius apart from many of his brothers. He understood the value of protecting and elevating humanity beyond mere survival. This suggests he may have been good for spearheading humanitarian efforts, such as improving living conditions on hive worlds or forge worlds, or overseeing the reconstruction of war-torn planets. He may have been able to advocate for reforms to the Imperium's bureaucracy, ensuring that the needs of the people were not entirely eclipsed by military and logistical priorities. While Sanguinius was not explicitly religious, his angelic image and moral clarity made him a natural figurehead for the imperial creed as it would later arise in the form of the Ministorum. Perhaps he may be good in a religious role, lending his image and legacy to the foundations of the ecclesiarchy. He might have been able to guide his early doctrines towards uplifting rather than oppressive practices. and acting as a counterbalance to the excesses of figures like Lorgar, he may have been able to ensure that faith in the emperor remained grounded in hope rather than fear. Sanguinius had a keen mind for strategy and an understanding of the larger picture, as demonstrated during the Great Crusade and the Siege of Terra. He may have been good for coordinating long-term strategies for the Imperium's growth and stability, balancing military campaigns with economic and cultural development. He may have served as a visionary advisor to the High Lords of Terra, helping chart the Imperium's course towards a brighter future, and mediating some of the excesses of the sometimes terrible Lords of Terra. While Sanguinius had many strengths, there are potential challenges to his role in governance. First, he died. I'm joking. This is like a counterfactual if he didn't die or if it was earlier. Okay, so there's the burden of the Red Thirst, his internal struggle with the Red Thirst, and his knowledge that somewhere else his legion was struggling with the Red Thirst might make long-term governance taxing, particularly in peaceful or administrative settings. Those would leave little outlet for his impulses towards combat and little room to see his sons. Then there's the perception of him as a demigod. His angelic appearance might lead to excessive reverence, complicating his efforts to connect with people as equals or to foster democratic processes. His idealism might clash with the authoritarian or pragmatic tendencies of brothers like Guilliman or Dorn, particularly in debates about the Imperium's future, and his unwillingness to put up with expedient means, which were bad for a bunch of people, might put him in conflict with the Lords of Terra. While Rabute Guilliman is often regarded as the quintessential administrator, Sanguinius's approach would differ in tone and focus. Guilliman was expedient, pragmatic, disciplined, and methodical, focused on efficiency and order. Sanguinius was more inspirational, compassionate, and visionary, focused on unity and hope. Together, they might have balanced one another, combining Guilliman's structural and institutional reforms with Sanguinius's ability to inspire and uplift the human spirit. Through the lens of the Fisher King, I feel that Sanguinius's tragic legacy can be thematically linked to the ecclesiarchy and the imperial cult, as well as the broader ideals of martyrdom and sacrifice that define the Imperium's spiritual framework. His death, his angelic imagery, and the enduring symbolism of hope and redemption resonate deeply with the foundational myths of the Imperium's religious institutions. The ecclesiarchy, the dominant religious institution of the Imperium, draws much of its fervor and iconography from the mythos surrounding Sanguinius. His martyrdom at the Siege of Terra, dying heroically to protect the emperor and confront Horus, became a cornerstone for the imperial faith. Sanguinius's willingness to face Horus alone reflects the idea of a king sacrificing himself to try to heal his kingdom. But it also brings in the idea of the Fisher King. If the king is wounded or killed, the land is left scarred. The ecclesiarchy often casts Sanguinius as the ultimate example of loyalty, purity, and divine grace. The angelic portrayal aligns him with religious archetypes, making him a central figure in the narrative of faith, triumphing over despair. Sanguinius's martyrdom and death elevated him to a saint-like figure, first among equals, with the triptych of Dolan, Thor, and Sanguinius directly underneath the altar of the Emperor, encouraging billions across the Imperium to embrace suffering and sacrifice as a way to emulate his example. The narrative of his martyrdom feeds into the theme of pain and loss becoming a transformative force, but it is also a story which can be used by the powerful to justify the oppression suffered by the weak. The red thirst, the genetic flaw inherited by the Blood Angels, reflects the shadow cast by Sanguinius's perfection. Like the Fisher King's wound as an allegory, this affliction is a reminder of the fallibility and corruption lurking beneath the surface of even the most glorious legacies. The red thirst symbolizes the cost of the Imperium's ideals. Just as the Imperium's religious devotion can breed fanaticism and excess, the Blood Angel's genetic flaw represents the darker consequences of striving for angelic perfection, but leaving one's base needs unsatisfied. The Blood Angel's constant battle against the red thirst mirrors the Imperium's unending fight for survival. This ties Sanguinius's legacy to the broader narrative of the Fisher King, where the wound never fully heals, but compels those affected to persevere. There are other institutions that we might think of as being linked thematically to Sanguinius with the Fisher King idea. The Inquisition, maybe. Sanguinius's prophetic foresight and ability to see possible futures resonate with the Inquisition's role as a guardian against unseen threats. With Sanguinius dead, the Inquisition embodies the darker side of this legacy, the willingness to sacrifice countless lives for what they perceive to be necessary for the survival of the Imperium. The Blood Angels Legion itself, their artistry, nobility, and tragic flaws directly tie them to Sanguinius's ethos. As a Fisher King figure, his wound becomes the defining characteristic of his kingdom that he's linked to. So he dies, they have the red thirst and the black rage. Their struggle for redemption reflects the broader Imperium's attempt to reconcile its ideals with its harsh reality. The Ecclesiarchy's elevation of Sanguinius into a messianic figure serves the Imperium's need for unity and hope, but this glorification also obscures the pain and humanity of his story. This is why you pick a dead figure for your propaganda. You get to use them as you like. The narrative failings of the post-heresy Imperium can sometimes be tied to Sanguinius's absence. The Imperium has fanaticism over compassion. Sanguinius was a symbol of hope and redemption, but the Ecclesiarchy transformed these ideals into oppressive dogma. His legacy, meant to inspire, became a tool of control. His death reinforced the Imperium's culture of martyrdom, where suffering and sacrifice are glorified, without addressing the systemic problems that cause the need for that suffering and sacrifice. If Sanguinius were around, maybe he would question why the average life of an imperial citizen is bad. And then there's the inability to heal. The Imperium's fixation on Sanguinius's sacrifice makes the Imperium into the Fisher King's wounded kingdom. It venerates his death without truly embodying his ideals of compassion, beauty, and hope. Sanguinius's narrative through the Fisher King lens here is tied to the Ecclesiarchy, the Imperial Creed, and the Blood Angels, symbolizing both the Imperium's enduring hope and its tragic inability to rise above its flaws. If you have additional ideas for imperial institutions and imperial policies, which might be symbolic of Sanguinius's absence as a Fisher King character, go ahead and leave a comment, or maybe make your own video. What opportunities for friendship with other Primarchs may have been good options for Sanguinius? As one of the most compassionate and as the most universally admired Primarch, Sanguinius had a unique potential for friendship with many of his brothers. However, his idealism, empathy, and angelic nature made him a figure who could bridge gaps and offer emotional support, even to those Primarchs who were otherwise isolated or mistrusted. I think I've found some Primarchs with whom Sanguinius might have formed meaningful friendships, along with the opportunities and challenges that some of these bonds might have presented. Guilliman, maybe. Guilliman, despite his lack of personality, shared a vision of a better Imperium. Guilliman admired Sanguinius's nobility and leadership qualities, while Sanguinius respected Guilliman's practicality and vision for governance. Their shared commitment to humanity's future might have deepened their bond. Perhaps Guilliman could provide a grounded perspective for Sanguinius, tempering his idealism with realism, while Sanguinius could inspire Guilliman to dream bigger and embrace the spiritual and emotional needs of the Imperium. Maybe Horus before he fell to chaos. As War Master, Horus naturally sought to form strong bonds with his brothers. Sanguinius's charisma and emotional intelligence made him one of Horus's closest confidants. Horus appreciated Sanguinius's ability to inspire and unite others, qualities that complemented his own leadership, and appreciated that when Sanguinius backed him up on something, it made his other brothers more likely to go along with it. In at least one of the Horus Heresy novels that I know about, Horus specifically said Sanguinius should have been War Master instead. High praise. Perhaps Horus's ambition and charm could have found balance in Sanguinius's humility and selflessness. Their friendship might have been a key to stabilizing Horus's ego and preventing his fall, if only the seeds of jealousy had not been sown. Vulcan would be a great option. Both Primarchs shared a deep compassion for humanity. Vulcan's humility and kindness mirrored Sanguinius's empathy, and they both valued the protection of the innocent above all else. Vulcan's grounding presence could have offered Sanguinius a safe space to express his fears and burdens. Sanguinius, in turn, could have encouraged Vulcan to take on a larger leadership role within the Imperium after recognizing his moral strength. Perhaps Corvus Corax. Corax, a champion of the downtrodden and oppressed, shared Sanguinius's commitment to humanity's welfare. Both were deeply idealistic and burdened by the darker realities of the Imperium, such as the use of servitors and the horrible living conditions on hive worlds and forge worlds. Sanguinius's optimism could have provided Corax with hope and reassurance in the face of his doubts and struggles, while Corax's pragmatism, expediency, and experience with rebellion might have tempered Sanguinius's idealism. Perhaps Jagatai Khan, his independent spirit and love of freedom, would have resonated with Sanguinius's desire for a brighter, less oppressive Imperium. They shared a sense of beauty and artistry, albeit expressed in different ways. Sanguinius could have helped the Khan connect more deeply with his brothers and the Imperium, while the Khan's unconventional perspective might have inspired Sanguinius to think outside the rigid structures of the Imperium. Fulgrim, maybe, before the lair. Fulgrim's appreciation for beauty and perfection could have aligned with Sanguinius's angelic grace and idealism. They both had a desire to elevate humanity, albeit through different means. Sanguinius could have tempered Fulgrim's vanity and helped him focus on the larger purpose of the Great Crusade, while Fulgrim might have encouraged Sanguinius to embrace his own artistic and creative inclinations. There were some which would have been challenging, but maybe possible. Perturabo? Here's why I think it could work. Sanguinius's empathy and his unwillingness to judge others harshly might have been uniquely suited to reach Perturabo, who often felt isolated and unappreciated. He could have provided the validation and understanding that Perturabo craved. If Sanguinius could find a way to connect with Perturabo over shared burdens, they might have formed a surprising alliance. However, Perturabo's cynicism and bitterness, his suspicion of flattery, would have made this a difficult relationship to cultivate. Okay, the big one. Conrad Kurz. Woof. Here's why it might work. Sanguinius's deep compassion might have allowed him to empathize with Kurz's torment and tragic outlook. Both were haunted by visions of the Imperium's future, and this shared burden could have created common ground. Sanguinius's ability to see hope where Kurz saw only despair might have been a source of tension, but also an opportunity for growth. Kurz might have respected Sanguinius's honesty and moral courage, but the reasons why it might not have worked are obvious. Whatever, we'll get to Kurz in another video. Primarch's less likely to bond with Sanguinius and form a good friendship. Lorgar, maybe? His obsession with faith and worship might have clashed with Sanguinius's more personal approach to inspiration. Angron, the butcher's nails made meaningful connection nearly impossible for Angron. Sanguinius likely felt deep pity for him. He might have tried to reach out, but it likely would not have worked. He and Magnus might have shared intellectual discussions, but their differing approaches to humanity's future would have been a barrier. Magnus made an unexpected friendship with Perturabo based on their intellectual pursuits, but he was mostly separate from his brothers. Sanguinius's capacity for empathy and inspiration made him uniquely suited to form bonds with most of his brothers, even some of the more difficult ones. His friendships, however, would have required emotional labor and understanding, as many of his brothers carried wounds or perspectives that clashed with his own idealism, and it would have taken some work on their part also. Friendship is not a one-way street. Here are other matters we could discuss for Sanguinius in order to better understand his emotional needs. Feel free to discuss in the comments what you find most interesting, and then go make your own video. The burden of prophecy. Like few of his brothers, Sanguinius was burdened by prophecy, foresight. Particularly, he was burdened by the knowledge that he was fated to die at the hands of Horus during the siege of Terra. How did he cope with the inevitable knowledge of his death? Did it weigh heavily on him, or did he find ways to accept it and focus on the duty of his legion? Did this prophecy cause him to act more selflessly, knowing that he had limited time left? Or did it make him more resigned to his fate? The fear of inadequacy. Sanguinius was often seen as a model of the emperor's ideal of what a Primarch should be: strong, noble, and wise. But did he ever fear that he was not enough? This might have been compounded by the emotional toll of his knowledge of his own death, knowing that this would leave his legion in turmoil and mourning. Did he have moments of doubt where he questioned whether he was living up to the emperor's expectations, or whether he was a failure in some way? Isolation, due to his angelic nature. Sanguinius's physical appearance as an angel with wings, along with his elevated status as a near divine figure, likely caused emotional isolation. How did this manifest in his relationship with his brother Primarchs? Did he ever feel truly understood or connected to anyone, given how different he appeared from other Primarchs and from baseline humans? Was this sense of isolation something he struggled with emotionally, or did he use his role to bring others together rather than focusing on his own need for companionship? The red thirst and the black rage. The Blood Angel's genetic curse was a source of great emotional distress for Sanguinius when he realized how deeply it affected his sons after meeting them for the first time. Did he feel responsible for the curse, even though it was beyond his control? How did this affect his sense of self-worth, particularly as he had to lead a legion that he knew would, at times, be overtaken by it? Did he ever fear that the curse would eventually destroy them or cause irreparable harm to the legion? We know that he feared the red thirst would bring sanction from the emperor. Sanguinius was known for his selflessness, always putting others before himself and willingly sacrificing his own well-being for the greater good. How did this affect his emotional state? Did he ever feel emotionally drained or resentful of the endless need to sacrifice for others? His willingness to die for the Imperium, particularly in the final stages of the Siege of Terra, suggests that he was driven by an emotional need to protect those he loved. But how much of this came at the expense of his own emotional health and needs? Sanguinius was one of the Primarchs most loyal to the Emperor, but did he feel genuinely loved and appreciated by his father? Or did he long for more recognition and validation? How did the Emperor's silence on the subject of Sanguinius's fate during the heresy affect him emotionally? Did he harbor any unresolved emotional conflict about the Emperor's coldness or apparent neglect? Despite his loyalty, did Sanguinius yearn for a yet closer bond with the Emperor beyond their roles as leader and subordinate? The Siege of Terra was a deeply traumatic event, especially for Sanguinius, given his intimate understanding of his role within it. He knew that his death was part of the prophecy, but the emotional strain of leading his legion and knowing he would soon fall must have been immense. How did he deal with the anticipation of his death during the final days of the siege? Did he find solace in the idea of dying for the Imperium and the Emperor, or was there a part of him that wished for a different outcome, free of the prophecy's burden? Take this cup from me. Sanguinius was often seen as a symbol of hope for the Imperium, a beacon of strength and nobility. But did this responsibility weigh on him emotionally? How did he balance the need to remain a figure of hope and inspiration for his legion and the Imperium, with the emotional cost of knowing that his time was running out? Did he ever have moments of despair or doubt, feeling like he wasn't enough to save everyone from the coming darkness? After the Horus heresy and the death of Sanguinius, the Blood Angels were left to deal with this grief of losing their father, especially given that it was the fulfillment of prophecy. How did the loss of Sanguinius affect their emotional state? How did the foreknowledge that this would happen affect Sanguinius's emotional state? Did he ever experience guilt for leaving his sons behind in such a state? How did the emotional weight of their grief impact the legion as a whole? Was there a sense of emotional incompleteness for the Blood Angels after his death, a void that could not be filled? What about the effects of battle on Sanguinius's mental state? As a warrior, perhaps the preeminent imperial warrior, Sanguinius fought in numerous battles, many of them brutal and traumatic. How did these conflicts impact his emotional health, particularly when it came to the brutality of war, the deaths of his brothers in arms, and the occasional deaths of civilians despite his attempts? Did he ever experience a sense of emotional numbness or detachment due to the constant war and violence? Or did he remain emotionally connected to each battle, each death, and each sacrifice? I feel that these matters would provide a deeper understanding of Sanguinius's emotional needs, especially in terms of self-sacrifice, isolation, and the burden of prophecy. His journey from hope to inevitable martyrdom encapsulates the central emotional themes of the loyalist side of the Horus heresy, and exploring his emotional struggles could shed light on his enduring legacy. If you would like to explore any of these topics further, leave a comment and then go make your own video. That would be great.